I used to work for a very small tech firm about 5 or 6 years ago during the summer and fall months. Much of my work also involved doing stuff later on in the evenings and sometimes later in the night with servers and networking because of my experience in that field. I ended up being a catch-all guy instead of my boss, who was a cheapskate, hiring somebody efficiently for it. Because of this, I would often work really later shifts and ended up being a jack of all trades. My boss constantly refused to upgrade equipment and was therefore equipped with ill-fitted equipment. And since he didn't want to fork out the money to upgrade, servers were often crashing. Data would consistently need to be restored and sometimes lost. This put on a lot of extra work on my plate, but hey, I was getting paid decent money at the time, so I didn't mind too much. Besides the job, the building was out of town in a much woodsier part, closer to the mountains. I would always feel very uncomfortable leaving at nighttime, since I was the only person there, and when going to my car, I always felt like I was never alone, like somebody was lurking around, watching me. Although even with the minimal lights in the building, I never saw a soul. This happened almost nightly, and I worked a standard Monday through Friday. Sometimes I would start in the evening, 4 or 5, and sometimes not getting off till 2 or 3 in the morning, depending on my workload. Maybe a month or 2 in, it was summertime still, I began hearing strange noises, far off in the distance, maybe in the woods or something. I don't know. It was kind of like a very long, drawn-out moan, or something. It sounded deep, kind of like a woolly mammoth or something, maybe an elephant, or kind of like a very muffled elephant cry. Very freaky sounding, and there's really no animal I can pinpoint that would make it accurate. One night, when I was leaving, this would have been right around Labor Day. I remember that because my boss was gone the entire week. The sounds were non-existent. I never felt anything going out to my car. It was a nice change of pace. I was used to leaving, locking up, and running out to my vehicle to get it started as soon as possible. The nice thing was I didn't have to deal with any of that entire week. It was either Thursday or Friday of that week. When I went out to my car, same thing, no noises, nothing. And I sat down, and I started my engine. But before I put the key in the ignition, and as I'm getting settled and my seatbelt on, I heard something very large charging in my direction. Immediately panicked. I looked around, didn't see anything. It's pretty dark around the building, and there are a few lights, but they don't give too much illumination. Somebody, technically if they wanted to, could park far down the road, hide behind the building, and charge me. Although it didn't sound like a person, unless that person was 700 pounds. This thing was heavy and fast, and it was gaining in my direction very quick, but I couldn't see anything. This was over the course of maybe 3-5 seconds, with it getting louder and louder and faster. I was panicked, turned the car on, and swerved and drove out of there, not even stopping. I fled down the street like a maniac. The sound stopped, and I kept checking my rearview mirror. I have no idea what that could have been. It sounded like a bison charging my way in the darkness. That was the last of that, though. When I returned the following Monday, the sounds ceased. I never felt any weird feelings going on at night, and when I eventually quit that job, about a week or 2 before Halloween, I never dealt with anything more since then, and I have no contact with anybody who I met at the job or my old boss, so I have no idea if any of those things persisted. But this will always serve as one of the strangest, most bizarre and freaky memories I've ever had. This last fall, I saw something straight out of a nightmare. I don't know what it was, and I can tell you for sure, this was not a misidentification, nor was it an animal that I've never seen before. This was something from hell, or so I believe. I was with my cousin, and I was visiting his house. My cousin lives in eastern Pennsylvania, right up around the mountains, or the Appalachian area. He's a real outdoorsy type. Me, not so much, but I enjoy hikes every now and then. He hunts and fishes and does all that stuff. At the time, he had just purchased a really high-end, very powerful spotlight and was using it to shine into the mass acres of woods he has far behind his house. It was pretty impressive. With that light, we could see a lot. I don't know anything about how much it cost, the power behind it, or the lumens. All I know, or can remember, is the light was about as big as him, and it took a lot of strength to be able to move it and change direction. I'm sure he spent a fortune on it. I believe he said something about mounting it to the back of his truck for night hunting, or whatever it is he was going to do. Don't quote me. Again, I'm not a hunter, so I don't know any of that stuff. But I was in the back with him, and we were shining it around to test it. He had just purchased it that day, and he wanted to see its full light capabilities at night, how far it could shine, and what. Like I already told you, him and I were both very impressed with how far it could cast into the woods, how much it illuminated. But that's also the most terrifying part, and I'll get to that in just a moment. He was shining it around in almost a full 360 to see the entire area of what he could and could not light up. Before I tell you exactly what him and I saw, let me give you a little geography of the area. Since he's right up against the Appalachians, behind and around his house is probably several acres worth of meadows. I'm terrible with knowing distance and lots and acres and all that, so I believe he said it was somewhere, maybe 5 to 10 acres. I could be wrong, but beyond that was thick forest, and of course the mountains. I mean, his property is right up against it, so there isn't a whole lot of room. The meadows are beautiful during the daytime, sprinkled loosely trees all around, and then if you go further back, those are the same woods that he goes hunting in. I believe his family owns all of that. I don't know how many acres or how much, but I think he said before. Quite a bit though, and I know he hunts in them every season when he can. The meadows almost kind of slope down or angle downwards, creating a mini valley, if you will. This way, when he shined his light downward or in that direction, it illuminates almost all the entirety of the meadow, and the tree line, if you will. On either side of his house is also meadow, but much, much smaller, with tree line encompassing much closer to his home. Even though he was able to shine his light in all directions, it was more so the back meadow, which had a greater effect, because there wasn't near as much covering, so the light illuminated much, much more. Alright, on to what it is that him and I both saw. As he's turning this giant light and shining it down in the meadow, he stops for a moment, in excitement, realizing just how powerful this light is, and that it was well worth every penny he paid for it with. I too was excited, because even though I wasn't into any of this stuff, I thought it was pretty cool, having a spotlight that was practically military grade with how much it lit up. But what do I know? As he let the light continue to shine in the meadow for another few seconds, him and I both gasped in horror at what we had saw. The tree line, which now was fully illuminated, was starting to rustle, and not just move slightly, like something big was going to step out. It being the hunting season, my cousin grew excited. Maybe it was going to be a large deer or a doe, but instead something else clambered out of the tree line. Something neither him nor I have ever in our lives seen, and we have never seen since. Whatever this thing was on 2 legs, looking just kind of like a hairy man. It was built like one. Very stocky, very thick tree trunk-like legs, a very thick muscular torso, and large muscly arms. It didn't have lanky arms at all, and it had big, large mammoth hands, but the head was far more strange. It didn't really have much of a neck, and the head was kind of set into the body. The head, which is hard to describe, looked more like a goat than anything else, but not like what you'd expect. I guess it would be far more appropriate to say it resembled a goat, except it looked all wrong. Ugly, horrible, maybe a goat from hell. It had a very large, open mouth, kind of like how an alligator does, where the mouth is almost the entire face, and it was full of rigid, sharp teeth. It had also a very hairy head, and had horns on top of its head. Not like devil horns. They very much resembled ram horns, where they kind of gnarl and twist, and point out towards the other side of it. We didn't see the eyes, nor was there any reflection, but this thing was tall, easily 8 or 9 feet, judging by where it exited out of the tree line. This thing stopped and stared back in the direction of the spotlight. Then, very slowly, almost carefully realized it was revealed, and turned sideways, and walked about 50 yards to the other side of the tree line, and disappeared, only looking back once, like it knew it was being watched, and it wanted to very quickly make an escape. My cousin and I were both shocked at what we saw, and terrified. The entire sighting, I want to say, lasted 10 seconds, maybe a little bit longer. We got a pretty good look at it, and this thing was hideous. For only being maybe 75 yards away, there wasn't a whole lot we could do. My cousin and I basically watched in horror as this thing shown itself, and then walked into the tree line. We weren't sure what to make of it, or what to even think. I nearly wetted my pants. My cousin and I went back into his house, and didn't really say much about it. I could tell he was freaked out. I was thoroughly scared. I mean, I have no idea what we just saw. Could this have been a goat man? Or maybe a minotaur, although it looked nothing like you would see in pop culture the way it's depicted. A mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, and a head and eyes so sunken back in, it didn't really make much sense. Either way, it was demonic-looking as much as it was terrifying. Whatever it was, I never want to see it again. When I was 13, I used to go out all the time on our family pedal boat with my 2 older brothers, who were 15 and 17. There were various lakes we would go to, but I'll never forget the time that I, out of all 3 of us, saw what I believed to be a lake monster. Maybe a sea monster due to its size. Let me set the story up for you. We were all on the pedal boat, my parents on the shoreline, and we were maybe 200 feet out from shore. I can't be exactly too sure how far away we were, but like many times on a pedal boat, we'd keep getting stuck in not seaweed, but plants and stuff. It would keep getting stuck in the propeller, or whatever it is that propels the boat forward when you kick the pedals. I would kick one side, my brother would do the other side, and my oldest brother would help direct us in the front. Several times we'd keep getting stuck, so I would remain seated, and my 2 older brothers would go off on each side and try and pull as much of the lake weeds out of the propeller so we can keep going forward. At this point, we were probably maybe 100 feet, 200 feet, I don't know, a fair distance away from shore, and I don't know exactly how deep the lake was, but I'm sure fairly deep, probably well over 70 feet. We got stuck yet again, so both my brothers jump up to the left side and are trying to detangle things. As I'm sitting there waiting for this to happen, I notice off to my right movement in the water, when to my horror, I see what appears to be a large head popping up just so slightly out of the water. To give you a better description or analysis of the situation, the head was kind of reminiscent of Godzilla. Not that Godzilla's head popped out of the water, but a head that looked similar came to about the mouth line of this creature. The head was easily maybe 5 feet by, 2 or 3 feet. It looked very prehistoric, had white, sunken-in eyes, and a large mouth, full of probably 3 to 5 inch bladed, sharp teeth. This thing looked absolutely terrifying, like it came from the pits of the sea. It was a pretty large head, and it popped up slowly out of the water, stood there for a few seconds. As soon as I noticed it, I began screaming. That's when it very slowly submerged back underneath the water from whence it came. Unfortunately for me, it was too late. My brothers, who had ran to me because I was screaming, did not get a chance to see it. I tried to tell them what I saw, but they looked over, didn't see anything, nor could they see a shadow of anything, because the water was so murky. I told them we needed to get back to shore ASAP. So they were kind enough to take my advice, and we did. I never saw anything after that. We didn't have any issues getting entangled, and made it pretty safely back to shore. I told them, both of them, afterwards, I'm not getting back in that pedal boat again. There's something evil in that lake. They both laughed at me, but I told them maybe I was over-exaggerating with the word evil, but whatever it was looked like some sort of dinosaur-looking creature. It's really freaky. In fact, I actually found a picture online that I'm not sure if it's from a movie or what, but it looks nearly identical to the thing I saw in the water. I was looking online for lake cryptids to see if I can find anything, and although I don't think what I saw is in the video, the thumbnail of the video is almost identical to the creature I saw, and down to the teeth, to the way it's sticking above the water, to the way the head and eyes look. Nearly everything about it looks almost spot on. Makes you wonder sometimes. I wanted to share this story with you in honor of my late best friend who passed away back in early November from COVID-19. He would have done a much better job expressing the story, telling you every minute detail, and really building it up into something it should be listened to. An amazing story. But he only told me a couple of times, and so I will do my best to reiterate the story as I remember. And while I can't remember every single detail, the gist is that he went on a 10-day solo adventuring out in the wilderness of Alaska. On one of the days, in the late fall or winter, I believe. I could be wrong on the season, because I don't exactly remember in Alaska when the bears come out and are active, so I'm going to say fall. Plus, it wasn't cold enough that he was completely isolated and needed to completely survive. It would have been in the evening time, as the sun was setting, and he was bringing his fish back to his encampment about 3 miles away from the stream. When he described to me, what he saw was a large man-ape-like creature, probably 10 to 12 feet in height, a gigantic beast of an animal, killing and ripping the head off an adult male grizzly bear. I know that sounds intense, but that's what he told me. In fact, he even shook and sounded terrified when he talked about it, because such a thing does not exist in nature. He heard the commotion and was going up a tall ridge. When he followed the sounds a little more closely, he was able to look behind a tree and see down below where the commotion was going on. In a small clearing in between the trees, this man-ape thing was fighting off a grizzly bear. For what, I don't know, but he said he thinks it was its kill, because he said it had a doe slung over its shoulder, like it was carrying it back to its village or encampment, or wherever this thing lived. That's when the bear attacked it, and he said this man-ape thing grabbed the bear by the front paws, twisted them, nearly ripping them off in one sweep. Then it grabbed the grizzly bear by the neck and the head, and slowly tore the head off the body. The man-ape thing suffered a couple scratches, and even made some grunts and howls from being attacked, but it was over pretty quickly, without giving off much of a fight. If you don't know, adult grizzly bears are massive killing machines. They could take out a man no problem, and for this 10 to 12 foot tall ape-man creature to just take down an adult male grizzly bear, that's pretty terrifying. He told me that he believes it was an adult male grizzly bear, due to the size and girth. He wasn't able to clearly see the face or the front side of this man-ape thing. He said that the man-ape thing's back was facing him, and so its front was away from him, and he could see the bear coming up to it attacking it. And then it kind of shifted a little bit to the side, but more like diagonally, to where he still couldn't see the front or much of the face, just mainly the back. But even made the comment to me, even through all its thick hair, he could still see that it had rippling muscles, and was a gigantic beast of a creature. Very much like an overpowered man, or think of the Hulk, but instead of green, think of it as being covered in dark brown hair, and maybe not as overly muscled, but more human proportioned, and just very tall. After this thing took down the grizzly bear and ripped its entire head off, it terrified him so bad that he didn't stick around. In fact, he almost left all of his fish and ran back to his encampment, grabbed his revolver, and stayed in his camp without food or almost no water for the next 3 days, out of fear this ape-man thing would pay his campsite a visit. Although it never did, and he never reported feeling anything weird, smelling, hearing, or seeing anything out of place, other than that horrible sighting. That was about it. He cut his trip short by about 4 days, and decided to actually just leave everything. This man was out there in the bush, pretty far out there. There was no way there was any other soul around. If you know anything about Alaska and how remote the wilderness can be, then you would know that if he took his time to really go out there, miles and miles, it's pretty wild, and you become one with nature really fast. This was not this man's first time out in the Alaskan bush all by himself, surviving. He was training to be able to pull a 30-day stint of doing this, even working his way to surviving by himself in the wintertime, just to prove he could. Although after this happened, he stopped doing it entirely. This was a man who did not fear anything, at least nothing in the woods. He grew up in the woods, was very knowledgeable. He tracked, hunted, everything. So for him to tremble and be so terrified in the way he described, I can't help but believe what he truly had to say. It even bothers me. Unfortunately, his passing is just terrible, and he did not get a chance to retell this story, because I'm telling you, his version was so much more frightening, having seen the events he described to me firsthand. I didn't learn about the creature called a Dogman till I was later on in high school, when I had a first-on very violent encounter with one. It was my junior year of high school, and it was prom night. I was going to go pick up my girlfriend, who lived a little bit out of town, actually quite a bit out of town, on a long, windy road, scattered all with houses about, and a small church on the corner lot. When I arrived at my girlfriend's house, she was all ready, and her father came out with her to congratulate me and wish us a safe and happy time. When she got in the car, her father was on the porch waving to her, when his face turned pale and his eyes grew wide in the direction in the front of our vehicle. We both turned to see this mammoth-looking dog thing running towards the front of our vehicle, out towards the woods, jumping onto the hood, and pressing its face right up against the windshield in one solid, fluid motion. Then, just like a person, struck its arm back and then shot its arm through the windshield, shattering the windshield in one go, grabbing a hold of my girlfriend and nearly tearing her arm off. While this was going on, her father runs in the house, grabs the shotgun, loaded with buckshot, which I guess he kept on hand, and shot this thing square in the face. Before this wolf thing could tear my girlfriend out of the car, he got a good shot on its face, and it scurried off, running, howling, and making all sorts of terrible noises. My girlfriend was badly bleeding, and if it wasn't for her seatbelt being clicked in, she would have been ripped out of the car. Although, between you and I, I really don't believe it was the seatbelt that kept her stuck in the car. I just don't think this thing had the chance yet to fully pull her out. Whatever in God's name we saw, we called 911, and an ambulance came to treat her wounds, and the police showed up too, questioning me and her father and her. They just took it down as a wild animal attack, and they said we clearly misidentified a wild rabid dog or possibly a bear, but from what we all three saw was this tall, I have no other choice but to say it, a werewolf-looking thing run out of the woods on two legs, jump on the hood of the car, and press its face hard against the windshield, like it was wanting to scare us. This thing was hideous looking. It was so ugly. Think like hyena, but not quite. And this thing was humongous. When it jumped on the front of the car from the ground, it not only dented the hood, which we tried to explain to the police that a rabid dog or bear could not do that, and would not jump off the ground, which they ignored, but would not indent the hood. So this thing had to weigh several hundred pounds. And what rabid dog or bear would go maniacal and shatter the windshield trying to get to us? They didn't exactly have answers to those, so they just tried to jot it down and write it off. The EMTs had to take her to the hospital, where she received stitches because her arm was torn so badly, nearly torn off the body. She was in the hospital for a few days, blood all over her dress, and her father and I all had to receive some pretty deep therapy over this animal attack, if you will. I feel I should just say this so you understand. I apologize if my retelling is ping-ponging and all over the place. It was an extremely traumatic experience for me, my girlfriend at the time, who we are no longer dating, but still remain good friends, and her father, who I also still talk to. This is a hard event to retell and talk about and think about. It brings up a lot of tough memories. I honestly thought afterwards that werewolves were real after seeing that thing, and that's what attacked us and came out of the woods. But shortly after, I would learn about a thing called Dogman and hear about the Beast of Bray Road and several encounters that would happen in Wisconsin and Michigan alike. That's what drew me and my girlfriend then, that the only conclusive answer was that we were attacked by one of these Dogman things. I don't feel like there's any other explanation. Having just turned 21 at this time, I decided to celebrate with a few friends in a small road trip in Northern California. We were on our way to Crescent City, which is tucked up in Northern California. We were driving pretty late. It was maybe 11 o'clock at night, and the path is a lot of mileage of thick, densely redwoods. Sometime during the night, or during the drive, this large bat-like creature swooped down in front of the road, nearly colliding with our car, and almost caused me to swerve off the road and hit a tree. All four of us in the car saw it as it swooped down into the road, turned to look at my oncoming vehicle, and nearly collided with us before quickly swooping back up in the air. This thing looked like a giant fruit bat, except much more uglier, and also had some human-like features, kind of like the face, except it had yellow glowing eyes, which was very creepy. When it landed, it also stood up on two legs just the same way a man would, and even turned to face our oncoming vehicle, like it knew what it was. It had a blank expression on its face, but I'll never forget just how scary this thing looked. Like it was not natural, like it came from another dimension. And I know I'm not crazy. How could I be? All four of us saw it, and when we recounted it to each other, there was no detail mismatch at all. We all saw the same thing, and to this day, don't talk about it. Oh, I should also mention, that was the last road trip I've been on. I'm now 37. I don't intend to drive to Crescent City ever again after that. I live in a pretty small town, about 30 minutes to 45 minutes east of Spokane, Washington State. I'm a pretty avid fan of Dogman and cryptids in general, and I'm sharing this with you because I feel I have my own Dogman account to share. I mean, I haven't seen it physically, or even heard it, but I do believe there is something fishy going on in my neighborhood, and after everything I've ever heard and read, I can only attribute it to one thing. I live in a pretty woodsy part of a neighborhood, and my neighborhood isn't your typical suburban little area. You know, little houses packed together by trees, and a booming population. The houses here are a little more spread out, filled with more elderly people, hence I figured why the lower population. So, with those facts to the side, why do I believe there's a Dogman in our neighborhood, when I can hardly find anything Dogman related in Washington state? Well, in the past 3 to 4 months, all the neighborhood cats have turned up missing. I know this might be strange, and could easily be pinpointed to something else entirely, and not that of a Dogman. But hear me out. After reading several reports on Vicundiv's website, North American Dogman Project, and listening to several, if not multiple amounts of all your Dogman videos, there seems to be this common, reoccurring theme of pets going missing in neighborhoods. Sure, I know Washington state is home to the Bigfoot, and even though I don't know much about Bigfoot, I feel there is just something different about all the cats going missing. Most of the cats in the neighborhood are outside cats. I know this because I'm friends, or at least acquaintances, with most, if not all my neighbors, since they're all elderly, not afraid to talk to somebody, and not afraid to look you in the eye, like most people nowadays under the age of 30 or 40. They actually enjoy having conversation. So, since I've been here for years and years, I've gotten the chance to know these people, at least on a pretty okay level. Many of them, in my area, have talked about seeing a large black dog roaming through the area between the late evening hours and the early morning hours, sometimes only catching a glimpse, other times seeing it act very suspiciously. Now, I've never heard anything about it being on 2 legs, like most people see it as, only ever on 4 legs, like you'd expect. They don't draw any similarities to it, like that of a wolf. It's always described as just a big, large black dog. I couldn't get any specifics about its ear, face, shape, or even if it had a tail. But they said the behavior was the most nefarious thing. It acted like it was planning something, or acted suspicious. It's hard to describe, but about 4 or 5 of my neighbors now have reported to me seeing it. I mean, it's not like they see it and come to me and tell me. It just pops up through casual conversation and asking me if I've seen it yet. As of now, like I said, at least 5 of them have admitted to me that they've seen this thing around the neighborhood, popping up ever since roughly sometime in October. I'm not sure the exact date, but that's right around when all the cats began to go missing. I'd say probably by December, mid-December, they're all gone. I have no way to know for sure what it truly is, but I thought reaching out to you might be helpful. I sent an email to Vikundiv, but I haven't heard back, so I figured you're the next best thing to go to. What do you think it is? Is it possible that even in our small state of Washington, that we could be dealing with dogmen? Or is this maybe a Bigfoot, or something else entirely? Or is this just some big coincidence, and maybe, just maybe, we're actually dealing with a large pack of wild coyotes? I'm not sure what the answer is myself, and I really, really hope it's not an actual dogman we're dealing with. I'm not ready for that. Back in the summer of 2001, when I was driving my cousin's lifted truck around, I'm pretty sure I ran over an adolescent dogman, or werewolf-looking creature. We live here in the backwoods of northern Idaho. I don't know if you have ever heard of the theme park called Silverwood. Well, they're a pretty popular nationally known theme park, really one of the only things worth coming to in Idaho. Anyway, I live about 45 minutes away from that. It's pretty thick and woodsy out here, kind of a little ways from town, not too far from Coeur d'Alene, if you're familiar with that town at all. I've lived out here most of my life, except for the first 10 years, so I know the area quite well. And, roughly 20 years ago, I'm pretty sure I killed an adolescent werewolf, or what I thought at the time was a werewolf, but actually now, upon learning about things called Dogman, I feel like I ran across one of these things. Now, to give you specifics, I was 21 at the time, driving my cousin's lifted truck, which is pretty high up off the ground, and you have to climb up into it. I was driving faster than I should have, and this thing that kind of looked like a crouched over hyena, really ugly looking, stepped out right onto the road, right as I was passing by. It was a bend in the road, so I did not have time to stop. I'm surprised I didn't wreck my truck. Had it not been for the fact that it was lifted, I'm sure there would have been significant damage done to the front and windshield. So what had happened was, as soon as the truck collided with this thing, the grill was head level with this thing, and I think, judging from the damage, smashed its head in. Either that, or the impact from hitting it down to the concrete caused its head to be partially smashed in. As soon as I hit it, I was freaking out, thinking I just hit maybe a teenager walking around in a costume. It was nowhere near Halloween. Early August, if I can remember correctly. So maybe late July. Sometime after the 4th of July. I do remember that, but it wasn't fall yet. I immediately pulled over, grabbed a flashlight out of the bed of the truck, and ran to go see what I just killed, or thinking it was a person at the time, getting ready to dial 911. That is, until I shined upon the corpse. I'm not exactly sure what I was looking at. I just thought it was some sort of hideous-looking dog, except the way its body laid on the ground looked like it would walk on 2 legs. And after spending about 5 minutes, maybe not even that long, in reality, it was probably 2 or 3 minutes, because the more I looked at it, the more frightened I became, realizing this wasn't somebody in a costume, but a real living creature that I just hit and killed. I say adolescent because now that I believe it's a Dogman, and I know and hear how big those things get, and this thing, standing upright, had to have been no taller than 5 feet, and was very small and skinny, and very frail arms, but a very, very ugly face. Think hyena, but even more wicked looking, like it just had an evil expression, even though part of its brains were smashed onto the road, and part of its face caved in. But enough detail and face left and preserved that I could accurately see what it at least looked like pre-impact. While the head and part of the body were pretty badly mangled from the impact of my truck and it hitting the concrete, it was still in pretty good shape. It had thick, matted hair all over the back of its body, and even on parts of its arms. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Howling, but that's actually what it reminded me of, at least in the body. Very stringy, long hair, and kind of like you see with some wild dogs, even though the hair is very thick. Its hands were kind of curled up to its side, like it was almost in a fetal position, but not quite. After looking at it briefly, I had seen enough, and I had gotten serious heebie-jeebies just checking it out, convinced I had just hit a real-life werewolf. I freaked out, got back in my cousin's truck, and drove back to the house, which was only 12 minutes away at most. I got back and freaked out, told my cousin I just ran over a werewolf and killed it. Of course, I was met with ridicule and laughter, and told him, in an attempt to prove my point, I would drive him right back to the spot where it was and show him the body that I just left there in the middle of the road. Well, more like the side of the road, but still. So, he agreed to let me take him. We drove back there, and the creepy part, the body was gone. I know for sure what I hit. I did not spend 2 or 3 minutes, or 5 minutes, however long it was, staring at this dead body of a thing, and not hallucinating anything, or knowing what I did not hit. He just laughed at me, and then got mad, told me I was wasting his time, but the joke was funny. I can guarantee for certain that what I hit was dead. clearly dead. Maybe somebody drove by and drug it off, but wouldn't it be on the side of the road if that was the case? It just didn't make any sense. I didn't really spend a lot of time looking around. Like, I didn't see any bloody footprints, or as if it got up off the road and walked away. Maybe somebody came by and took it. I don't know. It is weird, but not really weird. I don't think it got up. I think somebody just merely moved it. But I kept trying to convince my cousin of what happened. He never did believe me. And that's really the end of that story. But as time went on, and I learned more about cryptids and the fact that dogmen are actually a thing, and don't just exist in Wisconsin and Michigan, but actually nearly all over the United States, I think I began to put two and two together, and realized I must have hit and killed a juvenile dogman creature. That's really the only way to describe what I killed. I mean, as far as I know, there is no other upright canine that walks in North America that looks the way this thing did. And when I say it was ugly, it was hideous looking. It didn't look like it came from hell, like I've heard some descriptions talk about it. It was just really distorted looking. Like I said, the face of a hyena, but much uglier. It did kind of resemble a wolf, but it really did look like a werewolf, if you didn't know what a dogman was, or never knew that dogman creatures even existed. Anyway, this is my story from nearly 20 years ago. I hope you enjoy it, and know that there are these creatures out there, and we must be careful at night, as to make sure not to run into them, and be aware of our surroundings. We never know, and we should always trust our gut instinct, especially when we know something is wrong. About 4 years ago, we moved to our dream home, in the middle of farms and woods. We have 8 acres, which backs up against some protected land that is undeveloped. Mostly old farms and woods patched through them. We are between Oxford, Ohio, and from what I recently read, the fabled Germantown, Ohio. We keep to ourselves, my wife and son and our dog. I've only met our nearest neighbor, a late 20s and early 30s female. I never see her leave. Her dad stops by from time to time. She doesn't work. One night, a few years ago, I went outside around 12:30 a.m. to walk the dog. I had a few beers on a Saturday night, as did my neighbor, most likely. She was hooting and howling, so I joined in the fun and howled back. No biggie. But this play started happening more and more. We started having weird stuff happen. Someone snapped our rooster's neck in the night and was coming on our property. So I set up trail cams. It didn't catch much, but some deer and coyotes. Bit one day, I went to check the cameras, and my SD card was missing, and the camera open. So I gave up on that idea. I'm a bit of a prepper. Okay, I'm a big prepper. So I turned the next few weekends into a full-on military operation to figure out who or what was coming onto our property. I got camoed up in a sniper ghillie suit and night vision. Had my night vision scope rifle out. Nothing. So, one night, it's Saturday again. Had a few beers, but not close to drunk by any means. Took the dog out when I heard the playful howl again. I thought it was my wife in the chicken coop, so I kept walking that direction. Nobody there. Huh. Weird. Must be the neighbor. So we got to the opening, to the 300-yard spread of brush and woods between our houses, and I saw what looked to be a naked person with long hair, kind of like a lion's and less hair on the body, but still a light dusting of body hair. It ran off upright. I didn't see a snout or anything like that. No fangs or glowing eyes. But I did get a weird feeling, like it was a big dog, wanting me to chase it. An overwhelming vibe, so to speak. It ran through the tall brush, and I lost sight. The initial contact was about 120 yards out, and it ran the other 150 to 180 yards quick. My dog didn't even seem to care, sort of like it was a dog it knew. Not exactly sure what it was, but it did not seem evil or dangerous. My daughter is 30, and back in October or early November of 2020, she was about 3 blocks from home, driving down St. Anthony's Church Road at roughly 8:30 p.m. This road is rural and very dark, except for the light on at a cemetery that you pass. That's when she noticed something darker than a shadow and huge go across that whole cemetery in a matter of seconds. This scared her enough to call me as soon as she got home to tell me that how this was so upsetting to her and she was now sick to her stomach. She was bothered by this and experienced nightmares, and her and I were surprised at how this had shaken her up so much. She still at the time never heard of Dogman, so a couple of days later, she was walking down across the road to the mailbox and a small creek with a wooded area on both sides across from where she walks, and she said that something or someone was watching her. When she walked, it walked. When she stopped, it stopped. And she experienced the same feeling in the stomach when she sees nothing or no one in the wooded area, since she's looking right through the wooded area because it's not thick as it was in the summer. She said that she could not hear anything, no nothing, and it freaked her out really badly, since nothing like that has ever happened to her before, except for riding past in the cemetery a few nights prior. Anyway, she hurried up and went back to her house and called and told me that she's being stalked by something that's gotta be paranormal or invisible. That's when I told her that it could be a Dogman. First off, this happened about 3 years ago. I was asked to put my encounter on this forum. I live in rural Tennessee, farmland, small town USA. So one night, early in the fall, my friend called me and wanted help with a newborn calf. I told him sure, jumped on my dirt bike and headed over there. When I got there, he had done delivered the calf, but the calf-skin mother was freaking out, mooing a weird kind of sound. My friend said he was going to lock her in the barn. Would I stay with the calf? So I did. He was gone not even 3 minutes, when I caught a nasty wet dog dead animal smell coming from my right. It was putrid. I thought a great dead deer was rotting nearby when I heard some branches breaking about 40 feet off to my right. I thought, great. Now a bobcat or some dog was going to be eating the rotting deer and make the smell even worse. But to my surprise, the smell moved. So I'm like, okay, smells don't move. So I shined my light in the area and caught a glimpse of something black. It was a blur moving so fast. I thought a bear, but I've never seen a bear in these woods before. Just then, I heard something to my left, and I turned towards the sound, shining my light in front of me, about 20 feet, and what I can only describe as a werewolf-like thing, right out of a horror movie. It was standing on 2 legs, glaring at me. My mind was thinking that this is not real. It can't be. But there it was, 7 foot tall easily. I'm 6'4", 280 pounds, no small guy. But this thing made me look small. It was sniffing the air, and it showed a mouth full of teeth. Then I heard a branch break from my right. I turned, and there was another one, but smaller, about 6 feet tall, standing on 2 legs. So I positioned myself so I could see both creatures, when the bigger one freaked me out even more. It took its arm and pointed with the huge clawed hands at me. I was truly terrified, and remembered the newborn calf still hiding in the grass. So, I reached down and pushed the newborn between my legs. The larger creature looked at me, shook its head, like to say, "No, don't do that." Just then, I remembered that I had my father's World War II Colt 45 that he had passed down to me. I pointed that at the larger creature, thinking I'm going to get one shot and die, but I was going out fighting. Just then, the larger creature made a weird clicking noise. It hurt my head, made my eyes water, and to my relief, the larger one went down on all fours and took off with the smaller one beside him. Like I said, it's been 3, almost 4 years since my encounter. I never told anyone. I mean, who would believe you that you saw a real werewolf? I mean, you hear about Bigfoot, but werewolves anyway. You can believe me or not. I truly don't care. I know for a fact what I saw. I lived in an apartment complex when I was in high school, and loved to hunt there. It was only 6 feet away from the parking lot. I almost lived in those woods. They had beautiful oak trees there with trails under them. So one day, I was hunting with my bow in a cow pasture, which had a barbed wire fence separating it from these woods. I had shot a rabbit there just a few days earlier with a razor blade arrow. I was walking down the fence line in the pasture, heading towards the corner where the fence went off to the left, towards the apartments. That's when I heard something large in the woods, coming straight towards me. Crashing through the brush, actually. It sounded bipedal. It made me really curious because it was very thick woods, and hard to walk through. Besides that no one ever went in this part of the woods except for me. These were like my woods. I called out, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" No answer. I repeated it. Still no answer. Yet they just kept coming closer. They got about 25 feet from me. It made me mad. So I almost jumped over the fence and ran over there to see who was only 25 feet away from me and did not want to answer. But then I remembered that I'd seen a man in his 40s with a long-barreled revolver on his hip, across the creek, coming from an area that had an abandoned barn, and that area always gave me the creeps. I just never went over there. So, I caught myself right before I jumped over the fence and said, "No, something does not seem to be right here." By this time, I was at the corner of the fence line. I turned left and continued to follow the fence line towards my apartment. Then, I heard bipedal steps of this, what I thought was a person, because 40 years ago, we did not believe in Bigfoot or anything like that. I stopped walking, and it stopped. So I started walking again, and it also started walking alongside of me, about 25 feet. The woods were very thick in Louisiana, so you could not see through them. As I walked, I made sure that my razor blade arrow was well notched, and never took my eyes off who was walking parallel from me. And then it came to a part of the woods that I could never get through, because there was a different type of bush there, about 5 to 6 feet tall, and they were very, very sharp. Once, I shot a bird there, tried everything I could to get in there to get my bird, and could not crawl under it or over it. I was not afraid to go through the brush. I had scratched my left eye twice and had to get the top layer of skin removed by an eye doctor from going through the brush in those woods. This thing started crashing through this brush. As I began to walk very fast, then I just saw for a split second a very, very tall black figure crashing through. It was solid black, maybe 8 to 10 feet tall. It had to have been huge to step over the top of these 5 to 6 foot tall bushes. I could see from about the chest up. It had its arms in the air and out in front of it, and its torso leaned forward, but did not see any clothing. I thought that was weird. That's when it hit me, that it was not a man, but it was something else. I had no idea what it was. All I saw was like a black silhouette type figure. I took off running, and it did also, paralleling me all the way to the parking lot. When it reached a large tree right there, next to the parking lot, it sounded like it started smashing and snapping large tree limbs from the tree, like maybe 4 to 6 inches in diameter. I jumped a fence, running into my apartment, which was facing the woods, about 75 feet away. I never got the impression that it was a Bigfoot. I thought it was something paranormal, but did not have a clue to what it was, since we didn't have internet back then. For years, I thought about why this creature decided to do this to me. The only thing I could think of was that I shot that rabbit a few days earlier, and immediately cut it open to clean it in the pasture. But as I began to skin it, I saw that it had worms under the skin, so I left it there. These woods were not very large, only about 1/4 mile by 1/2 mile long, and in an urban setting. So I said to myself, no way it could be a Bigfoot. But what was it? So I did not shoot anything. I don't eat. And do not even try to break the smallest twig when I'm in the woods, no matter how thick they are, or smash down any grass or make a trail. And when I pee, if it's possible, I dig a small hole and then cover it up. If I have somebody with me, I ask that they whisper, and feel like we should respect our woods and the animals, of course, and all the paranormal creatures that live in it. What do you think it is that I saw? Now, back a number of years ago, about 1998, I was deer hunting with a friend of mine here in central North Carolina, Chatham County to be exact. I was hunting with a good friend of mine on some property that his family owned. If you know anything about central and eastern North Carolina, it's the number of hog farms in the area and certain times of the year. Talk about stink. We were in a beautiful area, and we'd already scouted out where we were going to hunt. We got on our stands and got settled. Come 10 o'clock, we decided to meet up and see if we could not find a new spot for the late afternoon. We poured coffee and began looking at our maps, making a plan. All of a sudden, my buddy Bob looks at me and says, "You hear that?" I listened. I caught the faintest sound of what sounded like a man or a dog, screaming or howling. "What is that?" I'd asked. We both just stood there for a few minutes, sort of talking about what it sounded like. Just then, our third buddy came and rejoined us, saying, "Hey, you guys hear that?" Like I said, we were kind of taking a break, drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, and talking in normal tones, while the call, scream, whatever it was unusual, we very quickly blew it off. That's the thing with youth, is simply you can blow off what you don't understand. I suppose some 20 minutes had gone by, and the three of us pretty much on our way to a second location, about a mile from where we are now. We're taking a slow pace, as it's deer season. We take 4 or 5 steps, then pause and look and listen to see if we might have stirred something up. Any deer hunter is familiar with the cadence and how it's important to not disturb other hunters' hunts. We came to an open section of woods. Beautiful spot. Large hardwood trees had formed a very nice canopy over us, and you could see a couple of 100 yards out, all around. Just then, a second scream like before, powerful low frequency, but clear, not something we recognized. Then, without warning, our third buddy, Jake, let out a scream in response, scared the bejeebers out of us both, and we were trying to get him to stop, but he bellowed like mad in reply. Finally, Bob reached over and thumped him in the belly, which did stop him. He coughed. Then I said, "You idiot. You have no idea what you're responding to, and if you hadn't noticed that thing was closer than it was the first time." Then he starts acting all hurt, and Bob, having thumped him and I, told him to knock it off, or he was going to have to fight the two of us. Naturally, he started wanting to make light of the thing as a joke. So I told him, "Let's hope that's how it winds up going down." We didn't know exactly where. Whatever made that sound was, but it was darn sure we had a good idea where we were thanks to Jake. Okay, let's spread out a bit, 3 meters apart, and move this way toward our next hunting spot. Jake, I don't care if that thing starts playing at Freebird. You keep your mouth shut. We walked for a good 30 minutes, and Bob said this: "We aren't far from where we want to be for the next hunt, but it's way early for setting up. Let's have a seat and eat some lunch." That sounded like a good idea. We had great visibility. It wasn't like something was going to sneak up on us. So we made a small fire, boiled some water, and made ramen noodles. A great staple, even today. We'd gotten our stuff made up, ate, and talked of hunting, and anything else that sort of came to mind, and began putting out the fire, putting stuff away, when all of a sudden, that scream came back again. Only it couldn't have been more than a few hundred yards away at most. Almost at the same time, I noticed the air seemed to stop moving, and dead silence fell. Not a sound from anything. Talk about eerie. It was then that the other guys looked all like the blood had dropped out of their faces. We could clearly hear the sound of something coming toward us, but we couldn't see where or what it was. Jake looked like he was about to cry. Bob didn't look much better. Just then, I'd realized we had weapons and we had survival gear. We could make a stand against whatever it was moving around us, no more than about 70 yards out. Just to our left was about 3 trees, which had fallen and created a bit of cover. I looked at the guys and said, on my say-so, "Grab all your stuff and get over to those trees. Get inside of them and take up back-to-back positions. Ready? Go." We took off, got inside the trees and took our guns up, and were scanning about eagerly. Apparently, our sudden movements had alerted it, but we needed to be under some sort of cover, rather than out in the open like we were. Now, just as I started saying cover, whatever area was in front of us, each of us felt a sudden rush of wind come in like a wave. I mean, dead silence 1 minute, and then suddenly, a wave of wind came through. Not hard, but it just seemed completely out of place, and an odor came in with it, like nothing I have ever smelt. It was like heavily concentrated body odor. If you've ever been in a locker room, that was not quite up to standards of the cleanliness of today, then you know what I mean. Combine that with the smell of musk, and you get what I mean. It was nasty, very strong enough that I looked over at both my guys, and we got tears in our eyes. You guys see anything? They say they didn't, but something stunk to the high heavens. Okay, I'm gonna try something, I said. Don't freak out and don't panic. Remember, we have weapons, and if we stay together, we'll be fine. They nodded affirmatively. "Hey," I shouted. "We're over here, and we're armed." I heard nothing. Then I said, "You might get one of us, but I guarantee the other 2 will get you." I tried to use a strong command voice like the police often use to help control a situation. It was a bluff, but hey. "We will leave and never return. I have some whiskey for you here as a sign of my word." I was thankful I had a gifting pouch with me now. I'd gotten to the point that I've never left it at home anymore, but almost left it at home today. Just wasn't expecting this sort of complication. Suddenly comes an angry scream, like nothing I have ever heard in my life, like nothing I have ever heard before. I was carrying a rifle, and I located the source as best I could, then told my guys, "Put your fingers in your ears." They did, and I determined as best I could where the scream had come from, took aim and fired. The report of the gun was deafening, and now I couldn't hear much of anything, but because I warned the guys, they still had their hearing. Mind you, I wasn't actually trying to hit the creature, just let it know we were armed, and make it think twice about attacking. Then, being brave, I yelled out, "If you want to fight, then let's do it. If you want to let it go, okay, then let's do that. But we are leaving, with or without your permission." I looked over at my guys. "You guys are my ears for now. I can't hear a thing." And so Jake said, "I can hear something on 2 feet over near where you fired." And so I asked him, "Is it moving away, coming closer, or what?" "Seems to be circling over this way, getting behind us, like it doesn't want us to go further in," Bob had told me. In about 10 or so minutes, it had traversed around and behind us. It hadn't made any more sounds. "Okay, guys, let's head back the way we came in. Just head back towards the truck." The guys looked at me funny. "Look, guys, in about 4 hours, it's going to be getting dark. I do not want to be here when it's dark, with whatever that thing is out there, all interested in us." I was turned and talking to Jake, when all of a sudden, Bob opened fire with his slung gun. Bob, what are you shooting at?" His face had lost all of its color, and he looked at me and said, "It's a devil." He was racking to reload his shotgun. "A devil?" He looked at me. I saw it step out. It looked like a wolf, but it was on 2 legs like a man. He looked like he might go catatonic on me. "Keep it together. It's a Dogman. They are dangerous, but they know what guns are, and that we have them." I was trying to be as cool as I could, so I did not freak the guys out. I have no idea if Dogman knew what guns are. That was the story at the moment in time. Then I wondered for a moment, what was going to keep me from freaking out? "Okay, we're heading back to the truck. We're going to walk at as quick a pace as we can. No running, no freaking out. And no one fire off a shot unless one coming to attack us, and let us know if you see it coming at us." They looked like they weren't sure. "Hey, you guys can stay here if you want, and when dark comes, my guess is you'll have very little chance of surviving." My ears were still ringing from the guns, but the guys got up and began moving back toward the truck. I estimated that it wouldn't take us more than an hour and a half to get to the truck and get away. Once we were in the truck, there was going to be no stopping us. "Bob, when we get to the truck, I want you to take up a position in the back and ride shotgun for us if something comes at us from the front. Then we'll bang on the rear window." He nodded. No one talked. We just kept moving forward. However, after about 5 minutes, I heard a call like a wolf that you hear on nature shows, long and drawn out. The sound of it made all of us pause, as it sounded like the thing had not moved. Then it called again and again. All of a sudden, we heard another call from further away, like an answer. I had no way of knowing if the creature was calling for help or calling to locate, but I can only assume it was calling for reinforcements. I decided we need to do our best to be gone from there before the Wolfman cavalry arrived. We made our way progressively, making sure we have our retreat covered, and moving back as quickly as possible. Finally, with the sun still up in the sky, we arrived at the truck. Without a word, Bob was in the back, and Jake in the passenger side. I only stopped long enough to drop my gear and put it in the back. I grabbed my pistol, 2 spare clips, and set them on the seat next to me. I looked over at Jake and told him, "Keep that shotgun loaded and ready to use if we have to." Just looked like he was scared to the point of being frozen. I reached over and poked him. "We need you. You need to get in the game." He nodded. I later apologized to Jake over hot dogs for being hard on him. After all, this was a hunting trip where the tables got turned, and unless you've lived it, the level of fear can be debilitating. Not to mention, poor Jake had never heard of a Dogman, and Bigfoot was just a joke. And suddenly, he was caught up in the middle of some stuff he'd never dealt with before in his life. I have to give him credit. He did good, all things considered. I cranked up the truck and began heading down a dirt road that had rained a day before, so there was no choking dust to deal with. Suddenly, Bob yelled to stop and beat on the back glass. I stopped and jumped out, asked what was up. All he could do was point. The look of shock that was on his face spoke volumes. There, in the distance, a good 100 feet, maybe 130, behind us was the devil. At least it sure looked like one. Ears turned up, snout clearly visible, and standing way too tall to be a man. And while I've never actually seen a Bigfoot, I could see the proportion were all wrong for it to be one. I'm probably one of the few Bigfooters who would have seen a Dogman, not a Bigfoot. It just glared at us like it was saying, "Don't come back." It turned to the side, and I could clearly see the profile. The head looked like a giant version of a German Shepherd, only the teeth were more like what you'd see on a baboon. It had what looked like a longer neck, and it tapered out to the shoulders. The upper body was heavily built and appeared to be very muscular. The arms were long, but not overly long, and it appeared to have hands like a human. Only the fingers seemed longer than they should have been. I speculate that it might have had claws that gave it that appearance, but I'm guessing this now. I did notice a short tail that seemed to hang down. I'm not sure why that detail seemed to stick out like it did, but I have learned that you see the darndest things when you're scared. I could recall seeing it that it was on 2 legs, but for the life of me, I can't say if its legs were like a human or a dog. I noticed the tail, and can't tell you about the legs, but that's how it goes. I get back in, drove like mad until we'd come out of the woods, and returned to the small town of Silk Hope, which is a small unincorporated community consisting of several churches, a volunteer fire department, and the local school and a little country store. I stopped, got out, and grabbed the guys and said, "Okay, we didn't see anything, got it?" And Jake just said, "Are you kidding me? We need to call the TV stations." I looked at him and reminded him the reason we had to escape was due to him returning a call he didn't understand. How will you think they will play this on TV? What that was a Dogman. Bigfoots I might take a chance on, but Dogmen are dangerous and might as well eat you as look at you, I said. What? Jake looked at me like he didn't understand. Dude, you go to anyone, cops, TV, anyone. You're on your own. Don't mention my name. Don't mention his name. And trust me, not a day after that goes out on the TV, you'll be wishing you'd kept your mouth shut. I then paused and said, "I want a hot dog. You want a hot dog, Bob? Want a hot dog? Hot dogs are on me, guys." We went in and chowed down on about a dozen of them, and a couple of sodas each. I took them back to where we'd all met up, and they'd got in their cars and headed home. On Monday, I came into work and was asking a buddy of mine about the hunting down in Chatham County. He said there were far too many feral hogs in that area now, and they'd pretty much driven the deer away from there. I just nodded, but as I recalled, I didn't see much of any sign of feral hogs. I had a feeling something else was at work on that issue. Look, I don't know what it is you want to call these things. Werewolves, dogmen, dog soldiers. I don't know. But these things are flat out violent and very dangerous. Let me tell you my story that nearly cost me my life. For this story, we have to go back to wintertime of 2009. Somewhere around February or March, we had passed the worst part of winter, but it was still very wet and very cold. This night I was driving home, and was driving down a steep mountainside, filled with trees and forest all around me. The roads were very curvy, and although it was above freezing, you still had to be careful. Things were very wet. As I'm making my way down to the base of the grade, there is a sharp turn. As I'm doing this, I noticed off to my left, there was some sort of, at the time, large animal trailing me through the woods. I got ready to slam on my brakes, thinking a large buck was about to emerge through the woods and run across the road. But as I slowed down, that didn't happen. In fact, whatever this was following me also stopped too. That's when I got a little unnerved, and I began driving. Then, this thing quickly followed suit, staying within the tree line, but also keeping up with my vehicle at about 30 to 35 miles an hour, which for a deer, if that was the case, isn't a hard feat. This goes on for maybe a mile or two, and now I'm beginning to feel uncomfortable about the situation. No animal of that size that I can see from the shadows follows a vehicle like this. This almost felt predatory in nature. Hear me out. My gut instinct was screaming at me to go faster. Already, I knew this wasn't a bear. This wasn't a wolf, and I know cougars or mountain lions don't get this big. Something was following me, and whatever it was, I don't know. So I began to speed up to about 40, 45. On the part of the road I was at, since I had passed down the grade, it was now straight, beginning to curve slightly to the right. And as I got to the curve, this horrendous-looking thing burst through the woods and charged at the backside of my small little Nissan truck. This thing shot with incredible speed and latched itself onto my back rear tire. The sheer force of the impact of it latching onto my back left tire was so strong, it sent my vehicle swerving, and as this happened, it tore the back left tire completely off the axle, along with the rubber and the frame, and God knows what happened. In this motion, the entire truck flipped several times and landed on the side of the road, all while I remained in the truck. Of course, the accident and impact left me unconscious, with a severe concussion and several scratches and bruises. But thanks to my seatbelt, I did not end up being projected to the windshield, being smashed by my truck. The next thing I remember, police are pulling me out of the vehicle, and I remember having a light shone in my face, probably checking for vitals. And then I lost consciousness again. Then I woke up again in the hospital, and I had a doctor come in, maybe 15-20 minutes after I regained consciousness, to tell me briefly what happened. Apparently there was an accident, and, luckily, some passerby drove by, saw that I was unresponsive, called 911, and you probably know the story from here. This all took place over the course of several hours. Luckily, even though I had a concussion and scratches and bruises, I'm okay, and nothing long-term or severe happened to me. When they had asked what happened, I immediately recounted seeing this horrible thing out of my side mirror, charging towards my vehicle. Before I even spoke, I knew if I told them what I really saw, they would probably immediately attribute it to me not being sober. I've never done a lick of drugs in my life. Sure, I'm drinking now and then, but I'm not really much of a drinker. In fact, I much prefer the life of sobriety more than anything else. So, I bit my tongue, waited a few seconds, and then told him I saw a large bear charge after my vehicle. The doctor's eyes became wide, and he asked me, "Are you sure a bear can tear the tire off a car like that? What did you do to provoke it?" I just looked at him and shrugged my shoulders. I did speak to the police briefly as well, giving them a very similar story. I couldn't afford to tell them the truth. I knew I wouldn't be taken seriously if I did. They probably would have either discredited me, attributed it all to drugs or alcohol, or threw me in the loony bin. None of the three I really wanted. Luckily, I was able to get a new truck soon afterwards, since the truck was completely totaled. But forget about those irrelevant details. I know what you're wanting to hear about. The thing that attacked me and my truck. To be honest with you, I have no idea what animal it was. I've never seen or heard of anything that looked like it. It did resemble a werewolf, I'll be honest with you. But I don't know what you want to call it. I've heard people refer to it as a dogman, and I know the concept of a werewolf is somebody transforming under a full moon. I don't even know if that's the case, but this thing was definitely an upright, walking wolf-looking creature. Long, black hair, tall, pointy ears, striking yellow eyes, and a very large head, full of crocodilian-like teeth, protruding out of its lower and upper jaw. This thing had the strength of a lion, as it pounced with incredible speed, and as soon as it latched onto my back tire, just the sheer inertia sent my vehicle tumbling, and in that one fluid motion tore the tire right off the back of the axle, and that's when I had the accident. It all happened so fast that it might be hard to recount the exact details, but I don't know what it did afterwards. I don't know where it went to, and I don't understand why it pointed out my truck and attacked it when it did. After I crashed, I guess I was technically just a hanging piece of meat that it could have easily gotten to, had it shown the power already to clearly tear the tire off an axle. Why didn't it come after me? I don't know. And who knows how long I was really sitting there, hanging upside down, until the passerby found me. The road I was traveling down isn't well traveled, and it could have been easily 30+ minutes before somebody even drove by and saw me. Makes me shudder to still think about. I don't know how this winter's been for you, in whatever state you're living in, but over here in western Pennsylvania, it's been pretty crazy. Crazier than usual, which is saying a lot, considering we're a state that gets hit with tons of snow every year. I think somewhere of around 100 inches or so every year. Like I said, it's a lot of snow. You better get used to it if you're living out here. Another thing we have a lot here in Pennsylvania is wildlife, which brings me to the reason why I'm writing you. I found tracks outside my barn this morning. Tracks I don't quite understand. They're clearly made from a canine, but no canine I know gets this big. I'll have to upload the pictures and send them to you via email, but I didn't want to waste your time, so I thought I'd reach out to you first, get confirmation that it's okay, and send them over. They're pretty large in size, easily 12 inches if not bigger. We're talking huge canine tracks. Whatever made this had to have easily been the size of a grizzly bear, if not bigger. I know that doesn't even sound possible, but I cannot think for the life of me what dog breed could make these. The other thing that really bothers me is the track pattern is not quadrupedal, meaning it isn't from a four-legged animal, judging by the way the stride is. It appears to be more bipedal. You can clearly see the stride pattern. It's like somebody was walking on two legs, walking around. And the other weird thing, wearing fake werewolf canid boots. The impression in the snow is quite deep, meaning that whatever made these tracks not only had tremendous stride, but must have weighed a considerable amount. I'm around 270 pounds, a bigger guy, if you will, and I'm 6'2". Even me, with all my snow gear on and my boots, can't even make half the indent as these do. So something is out there doing this. I know of Dogman, and I've heard there are legends all around the entire Great Lakes area, from Wisconsin to Michigan, and even all over western Pennsylvania. I've never seen one myself, but I've heard many stories from friends and family growing up. I never really wanted to believe they existed, but now, I guess I have no choice but to second guess. The footprints actually come out of a small section of woods that back up to acres and acres of national forest. This small section of woods kind of tails out, down to around where my house is and where the neighborhood is. I would say from my barn to the small section of woods or tree line is maybe 100 yards, but I haven't actually measured. The tracks lead all the way from the tree line to my barn, and then just seem to disappear. There's no traces of which direction it went, and I don't think it jumped on my roof, considering my barn is roughly 20 plus feet high. So I'm not really sure what to make of this. The tracks just literally disappear right as they go up against my barn, and it's the back side of the barn, where there's no window, there's no door. I currently do not have any live animals, just old hay and old barn supplies, so I'm not sure if there is anything remotely interesting for whatever animal making this to get into. I don't know. I have far more questions than answers, and I'm hoping, with your aid, you can help me answer many of them. Thanks for your time. My grandfather, who rest his soul is now passed, used to work as a police officer and eventually a sheriff for well over 30 years of his life. One of the most horrifying stories he ever told me about was when he had gotten a call from a fellow. By the way, this was in the late 70s, early 80s. Which year, I don't exactly know. Anyway, they got a call from a fellow on a small farm nearby, having complaints about some unknown animal attacking and killing all the cattle. Upon arriving there, he said he was nearly attacked and killed by what he describes as a large upright dog that hid itself amongst the trees and would jump down at his car, nearly tearing the engine out of his vehicle and nearly taking my grandfather's life had he not shot it in his eye and blown it out. At least that's what he told me. He always had a really hard time retelling the story. He would shake really bad, and you could tell it really stirred him up. In fact, he didn't even like talking about it, and the only time he ever did is when I kept asking him to retell the story. I probably had him retell it to me at least 4 times, and guess what? The details never changed. His reaction was always the same. I think he suffered from mild PTSD from it. Said he had never seen an animal like it. But after that farm had continuous calls about similar situations. Livestock going missing. Cattle appearing dead and mutilated. He would never respond to the calls or have somebody else go and take care of it. Not after that. He also had a very hard time explaining that what happened to his car. He said that a bear or something larger than a bear attacked him. But as you would know, saying that kind of thing around town, especially in the small town my grandfather grew up in and policed in, didn't take him very far. In fact, he was often mocked, made fun of, and even risked his career at several points. I wish I could give you more details on what happened, but he never really did go into vivid detail of what the creature looked like, other than it was very tall, large, pitch black, and hid up in the trees. I do remember him using the term panther, like it very much so acted like a black panther in its movements and how agile it was, but said it clearly looked like a very large dog. Same color though, pitch black, had massive claws, and said he can never forget about how striking its red amber eyes looked. Anyway, I know it's not too much of a story, but I feel like I would chip in my family's creepy Dogman story, because I feel like it's pretty relevant, especially with how popular Dogman is. Plus, after that, we have no idea what happened. My grandfather eventually retired, about 16 years or so after the incident, so the mid to late 90s. He never dealt with anything like that again, never really talked about it, and then he passed away sometime after. So, unfortunately, he's not alive now to get more information out of him. As far as that farm, well, It's only about 25-30 minutes away from my house currently. Do I have any plans to go around it and visit it? No. But here's another thing. I guess that farm is very close to a national forest. How creepy is that? Back in the late 90s, I was driving along US 169. This is in Minnesota, right by a very small hole-in-the-wall town called Page, of a population of maybe 500 at the time. This is when I saw something off the side of the road to my right. At the time, I was driving northbound, and as I approached closer, this dark figure stood up all the way, and it was right then and there that I got a fairly good look at what it was that had stood up. I estimate a height of around 8 feet tall. It was very hairy, long stringy hair, and quickly crossed in front of my vehicle in the dip of land in the median between both highways. It had very wide arm-to-shoulder shoulders and a large head, very pointed ears on the top, and long, very gnarly-looking legs, which almost went all the way up to its stomach, or so it looked. It had a weird lean to it as it walked forward, and did not walk straight up like that of a person would. It all happened very quickly. If I had to give a size to it, I would say it was pretty heavy-set and muscular, and very long-legged, almost disproportionately so, because the way it walked, I got the impression it could travel very fast, having very long strides. Again, it was on 2 legs, and walked across the road so fast that there's no humanly way possible that it could have been anybody in a suit. Why would anybody be in some convincing werewolf costume at 2:30 in the morning on the side of a highway? It just doesn't make any sense. That would have been the very first time that I saw this strange creature. Then, about 2 years later, this happened. A friend and I were driving back home from late at night again, driving through a small section of woods near another small town in Minnesota. It was also late at night, and we were driving very slowly. We were getting these awful whiffs of wet dog and rotting flesh. I had asked my friend if they had smelt anything while we were driving. Our windows were rolled up, so the smell was coming in through the AC. They said no. I was thinking about having them stop, but I was too focused on the road ahead of me. I asked them if they had seen anything, off the side of the road or on the side of the road, and nothing. But the smell continuously got worse. It was wet dog, but there was more decaying, rotting flesh smell than anything else. It was pretty pungent. Then, that's when we see these 2 large eyes pop up from the side of the road. In fact, the exact same side that I saw this creature from a couple years prior. It popped up, and then quickly leapt all the way across this 2-lane road into the other section of woods. Maybe about a 15-foot leap, all within 2 seconds. I didn't get as good of a look, but it looked to be nearly identical to the creature I saw prior, a couple years before. Even though we were roughly 300 miles away from that spot, it looked to be even uglier, and maybe a larger version of what I saw. It really freaked my friend out. He kept going on and on about what was that, and I calmly brought up my story from 2 years ago, saying that I think I saw some sort of strange creature, since I never brought up that story anyway. I mean, nobody would believe me. I was freaked out too, but I feel like now that he saw it, and I saw it, I can bring up my story and give him some reassurance that I too saw it and had seen it before. Although it didn't really help. We were both pretty scared, and double-timed it back to his house. We haven't talked about it since. I mean, this was nearly 20 plus years ago, but it serves as a reminder to be careful on the back roads in the middle of the night. You never know what might pop out of the woods, whether it be deer or something else. As far as the creature I saw, or I guess we saw, I have no idea what it is. Even though it looked werewolf-like, I don't believe it was truly a werewolf, since the idea of somebody transforming under a full moon just seems ridiculous. But I think that this might be some sort of undiscovered wolf animal, or maybe a hybrid of sorts. Maybe the only hybrid wolf bipedal creature that lives in the North America. I don't know. I'm just trying to speculate, because that's the only thing that could possibly make sense. I didn't feel any harm, like it wanted to kill us or hurt us. I just feel like maybe both times I'd caught it off guard. If you've ever had the pleasure of driving through a blizzard, you'll know that it's not fun. If you've ever had to do it, you'll know that conditions can be extremely dangerous and even prove fatal if you're not careful. This very evening that I was driving through a solid whiteout, and at the time was up near the border of Canada in the winter, when I was in this horrendous snowstorm. Completely white all around me. I could barely even see the road. I don't even know if there was other vehicles around me, because it was completely whited out. And then I saw something, appearing out of the left-hand side, coming in my direction, approaching me. It stuck out like a sore thumb, which is probably the only reason I even noticed it in the first place, was because just how dark it was, kind of like it was absorbing the light around it. White and snow reflect light, but this seemed to absorb it. I know it's a strange description, but that's what it was like. Almost kind of a supernatural quality to it. It looked exactly like a huge dog, at least the silhouette of it. And the first thing I noticed, besides its ears and head, was this large silhouette, this huge upright dog walking on its hind legs. Then, I noticed very tall, pointy, perky ears, and a massive head, easily like putting a lion's head on a dog body, completely disproportionate, and didn't even seem physically possible. It came so fast towards my vehicle, I had to swerve off to the side of the road, in hopes this thing would not hit my vehicle. Well, I was going slow enough that I was able to turn my steering wheel in the opposite direction and press on the gas, knowing that I was easily risking my life and the safety of others around me. But this thing then jetted off in the opposite direction, away from my vehicle. I'm very lucky I did not crash or skid off into a ditch, or worse. What it was, I have no idea. I remember at the time, all I can think to myself was, what was that? I can tell you for sure that it was not a dog. That much I do know. But what thing looks like a dog, at least in silhouette form, and walks on two legs? And where did it come from? Why was it approaching my vehicle? It creeped me out, and I never stopped thinking about it, all the rest of the way up into Canada. Back in 1994, I saw something that I'll never forget. It was pretty late at night, around 2:33 a.m. in the morning, and I was working on scraping all the snow off my car window, since my job required me to get up early and leave early. It was at least an hour commute, and I had to be there by 4:30 sharp. And in this point in time, I was in easily the worst shape of my life. This was long back before I got in really fit shape, and at the time was drinking copious amounts of coffee, energy drinks, and anything I could to even function during the day. I was getting terrible sleep at night, probably due to my diet, so I tried to make up for it any time I could. But that's besides the point. After getting all the snow off my car, I got in and got ready to head off to work, when I saw the most strange animal in my life approaching my vehicle from the front. My mind began racing as I realized just how large this animal was, and then it did something that was more terrifying than you could ever imagine. It, whatever this thing was, stood up on two legs and crossed my 7-foot wide path right up to my vehicle, crouched down on one knee, and looked right at me through the front of my window. It had a dark reddish-brown fur covering its entire body. I'll never forget how scared I was. It was even taller standing up on two legs than the very top of my car. It stood at least 7 feet tall, and stood very comfortably, just like a man would. The face was what really stuck out to me, and what really gave it away as something not of this world. It looked like a cross between a wolf and a monkey's face, with a pronounced brow, large jawbones, and a mouth full of long sharp teeth, and a shorter, more condensed muzzle. It also had human-like characteristics to its face, more around the corners of its mouth and its eyes, like it could give proper expression. Frozen and terrified, not sure what I should do, just slammed the car into drive, putting my foot all the way down on the gas pedal, as if I had a lead foot. I flew forward, and this thing dove out of the way just in time to avoid being hit. But it's not like me hitting it with my tiny car would have done anything. My car would have been the one to take the damage from whatever this thing was. But when it leapt out of the way, it was like lightning fast, inhumanly possible, like the blink of an eye just gone out of the way, and I drove forward onto my driveway road and off onto the side road. I flew out of there much faster than I should have. In fact, I'm surprised I did not wreck. It was considerably cold that morning, and there was lots of ice and moisture on the road. I could have easily flew off the road and hit a tree and died. But I didn't care. Anything to get me away from whatever that creature was. I have a pretty scary encounter to share with you. This happened back in 1989 when I was a senior in high school, and I took my girlfriend outside of the city of New Orleans to a low bayou. This would have been at nighttime, and we wanted to escape from the wrath of our parents. We had it planned out all week long. We would leave on Friday without our parents ever knowing. I would take my dad's car. We'd go out to this nice little bayou in this spot we'd gone to before and make out. And if I was lucky, maybe even more would come from it. Well, I'm here to tell you that even in my own horny 18-year-old self, nothing ever did, and here's why. I picked up my girlfriend. We went out to our perfect spot on this calm little bayou. We laid a blanket down, and things got hot and heavy pretty quick. And just like typical horror movie fashion, my girlfriend started freaking out, thinking she heard something. I tried to convince her that it was nothing. It was just the sound of things around us, animals and whatnot, that we were totally fine. We made out for another moment or two, where she began screaming and pointing. Confused, I looked to see in the direction she was pointing at. In the trees, maybe about 30-40 feet away, was the face of a large wolf-looking shape. That's the best I can describe it to you. It was dark, and there was only a little bit of moonlight, so you couldn't see the best. But what was sticking out of the trees looked to be that of a very large wolf head, just going by the details of the lighting we could see. I didn't see any eyes, but it looked kind of creepy looking. And she said that wasn't there before. It's staring at us. Oh my gosh, we gotta get out of here. It's gonna get us. I tried to calm her down, saying it's just an illusion, since it wasn't moving. Or maybe it was a part of the trees. But then it did start to move, back and forth, like it was swaying, getting ready to charge. And that's how I can best describe it to you. This really put us both in a very uneasy spot and freaked us out. We both got up and started running back to the car, knowing full well we had just encountered some sort of wolf-looking thing out in the wilderness. Not sure what it was. I never thought of it as a werewolf, but it did definitely give off a very bad vibe, and judging by the size of that head, I have no idea what kind of giant wolves live out in the bayous of Louisiana, but I was not about to find out that night. That same girlfriend and I actually ended up marrying in 1993, and 9 years later, divorcing in 2002. We had 3 kids together, and she passed away of breast cancer back in 2011. In the first week of May 2020, I had a rather violent Dogman encounter. Due to reasons that I will explain in my story, I'm not comfortable with giving my name or the details of exactly where this happened. Although, I am the main participant in this encounter. The experience was shared with a dozen or more people, in one way or another. My hope is that one of the others that was there that night, who has more balls than I do, will hear this, and be brave to come forward publicly, or at least release some of the pictures taken that night. Here we go. I'm a pretty normal guy, living in the suburbs of Delaware, on the border of southeastern Pennsylvania. I'm a lover of the outdoors, and in the past few years, I have not had the time to really get out into nature like I should, and get my much-needed dose of the natural world. In 2019, I opened my own online business. My business struggled for the first year, but then due to COVID-19 and the whole world being stuck at home on their computers, my sales tripled the first half of 2020 and continues to blow up to this day. I have 2 kids who are now very responsible and trustworthy teenagers. My girlfriend is a nurse at a local hospital and is considered an essential worker, so the pandemic has kept her very busy this year. I turned 40 this year as well, and for the first time in my adult life, I had some time on my hands, and I was itching to get away from civilization. I have an internet hotspot router built into my SUV. It works almost anywhere, no matter how remote. So, with a laptop, I figured I could work from the road, take a few days to go fishing, breathe some fresh air. Neither of my teenagers were interested in joining me, and like I said, my girlfriend was far too busy with work. So, I took my best friend with me, a 120-pound pit bull lab mix named Pete. He makes a great camping dog. He's incredibly lazy, and I never have to worry about him running off to chase deer or anything. He will lay on his blanket next to the fire all day and night, unless I make him head out with me. But as I have learned while camping with Pete, if coyotes, bears, or any other predators come around, he snaps out of his laziness and protects camp. Despite his easygoing demeanor, Pete is pretty intimidating, as he is 120 pounds of solid muscle with no fat, which always blows my mind because of how lazy and inactive he is. I try to go camping at least once a year, and when I do, I usually rough it with a small tent and whatever else I can carry on my back. This time, I decided that I wanted to have as many comforts of home and really pamper myself. So I hitched my 10-foot enclosed cargo trailer to my very large SUV, filled it with all the things I would want to be really comfy. I brought my full-sized backyard grill, a 12x12 pop-up canopy, an air mattress, 2 large coolers full of food, and a fancy 6-person tent. The campground I decided to go to is a large one, and it is mostly used by the RV kind of crowd. But on the far end right, next to the best fishing area, they have half a dozen or so, just plain old campsites, no power or water hookups. My campsite was bordered by about 50 yards of thick woods that separated my camp from a large, fast-moving stream that is well known to be one of the best trout fishing spots in the entire state. On the other side of the stream is a steep mountain side, covered in rock overhangs and small caves. It is a beautiful area, and I love falling asleep to the sound of water. I set up the camp so that my SUV trailer and pop-up canopy make a sort of U-shape and block most of the view into my area from all the rest of the campers. I rented my campsite for a full week, starting on Friday, May 1st, which was the first day that the state opened up the state parks and campgrounds to the public since the pandemic shut down in March. I arrived at the campground about midday on Friday. The place was packed. I spent most of the day getting my campsite set up, and getting to know my temporary neighbors, cooking ribeye steaks, burgers, and vegetables on the grill. The weather in central Pennsylvania in early Maytime is pretty much perfect, so I decided to sleep in the tent each night with Pete and turned my trailer into my mobile office where I kept my computer, internet goods, mailing packages, and even a printer for printing postage. This way, I could work an hour or so each morning, get my orders packed up, and drive 20 minutes into the nearest town once every few days to get my orders shipped out. I remember thinking that I wish I could convince my girlfriend and kids to just sell everything and move into the woods to live, just like this. The weekend was crazy busy at the campground, and the creek was lined with fishermen as far as the eye could see. So, I decided to do some hiking and exploring into the vast surrounding wilderness with Pete, instead of fighting 10 people for the same one fish all day long. It felt great to get out to where I belong, the woods. The only negative was that it rained on and off all weekend while I was hiking. But to be honest, when you camp in Pennsylvania, you should expect to get rained on quite regularly. On the afternoon of Sunday, May 3rd, the campground cleared out fast, and by sundown, there were only a few active campsites left. I had gotten to know the two guys in the campsite directly next to mine, so we hung out for a few hours every night while I drank hot tea, and they smoked joints like they were cigarettes. Needless to say, they were always hungry and seemed pleased to have me next door with my full-sized grill and enough food to feed a small army. For the next few days, I worked online, fished the creek, and explored the mountains of the area on foot with my dog. We also liked to just walk around the campground itself, stop to talk with scattered campers who were there during the weekdays. On Tuesday afternoon, a few of them told me about a black bear who had made his way into the more accessible side of the campground and even raided their camps the night before. This had me a little bit concerned because I had a full-sized grill just sitting out in the open at my camp and had been cooking delicious food for days on end. I debated putting the grill inside of my enclosed trailer at night, but sadly, laziness got the best of me, and I left it out. Central Pennsylvania has a rather large black bear population. I was already aware of this, so at night, I slept with a Mossberg Maverick 88 12-gauge shotgun, loaded with double-aught buckshot in the tent with Pete, and just in case a rogue bear posed a danger to us, I had forgotten to pack my Ruger Red Hawk 44 Magnum for hiking. So, while out in the woods, I had to rely on my Smith & Wesson Shield 45 ACP that I already had on my hip when we left home. It wasn't ideal, but I figured it was better than nothing. On the night of Tuesday, May 5th, my new friends and I cooked up some delicious barbecue chicken thighs, baked beans, and baked some potatoes wrapped in aluminum foil in my fire pit. They produced a small bottle of vodka as well, and we made a few orange soda spiked drinks to go with our fancy campsite dinner. All the food and drinks combined with too much fun had worn us out a little early, so we parted ways and got ourselves prepared to crash for the night. A night that would prove to be the most terrifying night of our lives. At about 10 p.m., I loaded 4 shells of buckshot into my shotgun, got my tent all squared away, and lay down in the tent with my dog next to me on his bed and blanket. I put some Citizen Journalist news on my phone, put one headphone in my right ear, and kept my left ear clear to listen to my surroundings and to enjoy the sounds of nature. My tent was pitched close to the tree line, with the rear of the tent facing the woods. The noise of the frogs and insects at night was super loud and is kind of like a song that puts me to sleep better than any lullaby ever could. The next thing I remember is waking up, my eyes popping open to some kind of hollow metallic noise outside my campsite. I lie there, perfectly still, with my heart slamming from a quick spike of adrenaline, flooding all my veins. Then a bang. I heard the lid on my grill slam shut. I had stuck a fairly bright solar-powered motion light to the side of my trailer that lit up my small U-shaped courtyard area of vehicles and tents. My tent was facing the open part of the U, and I could see that my motion light was on, and someone, or something, was moving around my camp casting shadows as it went. I looked at Pete to my right. He was still lying down, but his head was up, and his eyes were as big as ping pong balls. He was clearly hearing what I was, but I found it strange that he was silent. It was then that I noticed the usual deafening noise of frogs and insects in the woods behind me. It wasn't there. Then, I heard whatever it was breathing. It was a hoarse, deep breathing that I thought to myself, bear. I could hear it walking around. Thump, thump, thump. And next, I heard it at my trailer, pulling at the side door, trying to get inside. So I sat up, grabbed my shotgun. One thing about black bears is that they are not the bravest animals, and any man-made noise will almost always make them run for their lives. So I racked the slide of my shotgun as loud as I could and chambered a shell. Instead of running off, the creature stopped moving and went silent. I could just feel the fear building up inside of me as I pretty much held my breath and listened. To my horror, it, whatever it was now, began walking toward my tent. It was then that I saw its shadow take shape as it drew closer. It was on 2 feet, and apparently huge. I sat there in terror and disbelief as it came right up to the front of my tent, breathing like a giant monster. I said out loud, "Whoever you are, I have a 12 gauge pointed right at you, so you had better sound off who you are." Right then, it leaned forward, right up to my tent, and let out the most terrifying, deep growl I've ever heard in my life. At that moment, Pete whined softly and cowered his head down. It was then that the shadow of its head was clearly visible. It had the head of a giant wolf with 2 pointed ears. As it was growling at me, I could hear my neighbors talking to each other. One of them shined a flashlight at the creature. When the light hit the side of the creature's face, I saw the eyes light up, just like golden LED lights. It turned its face toward the flashlight, and I could hear the man gasp and exclaim. Then, it turned its attention back to me and growled again. I decided that if I didn't do something, this thing was going to kill us. So, I lie back onto my sleeping bag, took aim at the shadow of the monster's head, and pulled the trigger. What followed was complete and total pandemonium. The monster screamed and roared at the same time. It was like the death scream of a woman, mixed with the roar of a big lion. Pete, finally snapping out of his fear, jumped up and began barking furiously. The thing ran off, and from what I could tell from the loud thump, it ran straight into my trailer. I clambered up, quickly unzipping my tent, and poked my head outside to see. It got up on its feet, and then ran right into the picnic table and did a flip onto the ground. It started grabbing its face, thrashing around. I could see there was blood everywhere on the trailer. I jumped out of the tent while chambering another shell. I aimed as best I could, with my entire body shaking violently, and right as it started to get up, I shot at it a second time. I'm not entirely sure that I hit it with the second shot. It stood straight up, and I pumped the gun and shot again. The third shot dropped it again. I was so terrified and taken aback by how tall it was when it stood up that I tripped over my own feet, falling backwards. Just then, I hear more gunfire erupting behind me, turning to see my neighbor unloading a large revolver into this werewolf-looking thing at maybe 20 yards. The creature was on its side and was kind of running in circles on the ground, gurgling and spraying blood. As it was doing this death spiral on the ground, it was moving closer to me, so I tried to pump the gun again and was shaking so bad that it took 3 attempts before the last shell even chambered. I just pointed the shot without aiming and could see the hump on the back of its neck rip open, spraying flesh everywhere. I was really close to it at this point. The monster stopped flipping out, and its limbs were twitching, while its head remained fully animated and flopping back and forth for at least another 10 seconds. I crawled quickly backwards, away from it, and tried to stand up. I realized that once I stood up, that I had been holding my breath the whole time, and when I got to my feet, my vision started to go black, and I fell over again. My new friend ran up, grabbed my arms, and began pulling me hard, backwards, away from the monster. I stood up, shaking badly, and looked at the guy with the revolver. His eyes were huge and full of terror. When I began looking around, there was at least 5 other people showing up there, with the same wild-eyed expression. I saw that at least 3 of them had come over with their guns. People were yelling, asking each other what happened, and checking to see if I was injured. I had blood on my clothes and my face. It all happened so quickly, but as is often told by people facing traumatic events, it appeared like it was slow motion. My dog was still barking, going crazy, so I did my best to calm him down. When I hugged him, he was shaking as much as I was. Before long, a small crowd had formed, and people were on their phones calling 911. After a minute or so, a few guys and myself approached the thing as it lay there, still occasionally twitching. We all stood over it, saying, "What is that thing?" over and over. Eventually, we all started saying, "It's a werewolf," in disbelief. All at once, people began taking pictures with their phones. Mine was still in the tent. The wolf man was dead. The top half of its head was basically gone, including both of its eyes and the top of its snout. I assumed that was the first shot that I made from the tent. The front of its neck was completely shredded, and the back of its neck was missing a large chunk of meat. Other than that, it was pretty much impossible to see exactly what other injuries that it had sustained, as it was completely covered from head to toe with blood. But we were all pretty sure that it had taken a buckshot or a .357 Magnum to the chest as well. There was a small river of blood running through the camp, right past my tent, from the puddle that surrounded this beast. Yeah, there was a lot of blood. It was on its side, and after a few minutes, we summoned the courage to grab some big sticks and flip it onto its back. It most definitely was a male, as it had a huge set of scrotum and testicles, bigger than my fists. It was huge. We never measured it, but it was longer than any man I had ever seen. It had dog-like legs, weird-shaped paws with a kind of small heel for feet. Looking back, I'm impressed that I was able to balance such a big, heavy body on 2 feet so small. It had a really skinny lower legs, pretty thick upper legs. It had arms pretty much like a human with long fingers that had filthy-looking claws, roughly 4 inches long. I noticed it was missing the top half of a finger from the battle. This thing had a stench around it that was unbearable. Like feces, fermented dog urine, and a 3-week-old dead skunk carcass combined into one unpleasant odor. Although its head strongly resembled that of a huge canid, the teeth did not. Its upper and lower jaws sported nothing but bug-interlocking sharp teeth, like those of a crocodile. No sharp molars in the rear of its mouth, like normal dogs do. Then, the second wave of terror hit all of us at once. The howling of multiple creatures sounded off in the direction of the mountain, just behind the creek. That's when my blood ran cold, and I could see the same big-eyed look go over everybody's face. We all knew exactly what it was. We also all knew that it meant we might be in big trouble. I ran to my tent and clumsily loaded my shotgun with a full 5 rounds, and grabbed my .45 as well, clipped it to my side inside my waistband, also grabbing my phone. All of a sudden, everyone was done looking at the werewolf and was looking at each other and into the woods in the direction that the howling came from. The numerous howls kept up for a few minutes, and to our relief, seemed to be getting further and further away. The police, game wardens, and paramedics showed up, all at once. I could see from the flashing lights that they had blocked the entrance to the campground, up the hill, off in the distance. The cops were just as surprised and freaked out as we were when they first saw the creature. The 2 game wardens looked worried and not surprised. They told everyone to not take any pictures and made everybody clear the general area. The wardens were both on their phones almost the whole time from then on. The paramedics cleared everyone and tried to get me to agree to go to the hospital to get checked out. I refused. The only injury that I had was to my hearing, as I was now half deaf for a few days from all the gunfire and noise. The paramedics were also very silent, looking worried, much like the game wardens, like they knew something. The police took my shotgun and the revolver from my neighbor. They let me keep my .45. They made everyone else put their guns away, and anyone who was there rounded up for questioning. Everybody was told to stay off their phones, which was not much of a problem, as only a few people's phones got even any signal anyway at that campground. When I asked the game warden what was going on, what that thing was, they told me they did not know, but that it looks like some kind of mutated bear or large unknown canine. A few hours later, an SUV, fully black, loaded with guys, showed up. They were all carrying large Glocks, dressed in cargo pants and t-shirts. They immediately took me and the others who were involved aside and began questioning. They told me that they were with the Federal Fish and Game. They were very interested in the howling we heard after the battle occurred. They must have asked me 10 times about where it was, how close it sounded, and what it sounded like, etc. They also repeated to me about 100 times that I was not to tell anybody what happened, and that they would get to the bottom of things and find out what I had encountered. They told me to tell anyone who asked about my trailer that I had to shoot an aggressive black bear. I assume they told my neighbor and anybody else who was on the scene to say the same thing. They made us open our phones, go through our photos, delete the pictures we took, one at a time. They also told me that if any pictures were to come out of the creature, that it would spell trouble for anybody who has them. They threatened me with all kinds of trouble if this got out. They did not try to pretend that I was seeing things. They point blank and politely asked me to not talk about it, and to lie about the trailer damage. It would seem that I was asleep for only about 2 hours before this Dogman showed up. By about 4 a.m., the officials had already gotten to everybody in the campground, and I assume the other people were told it was a bear and made to pack up and get ready to go. They said it was not safe, and they had to close the campground until they were sure it was fully safe. After the remaining pieces of the Dogman were bagged and tagged in a small fire truck and was brought in, all the blood was hosed off my trailer. Vehicle, the tables, everything else was all hosed off. Then a few guys wiped down my trailer and vehicle with soapy water. Regular old duct tape was put over the holes in my trailer, and they took my tent, bloody clothes, bloody slippers, as evidence, along with my shotgun. Right before I left, they gave me back my shotgun, wiped down and unloaded. They told me to fill my tank at the closest town and to drive straight home without stopping once. They were serious. They repeated this 3 times. Since all of this, I have learned everything I can about what I encountered. I listened to Dogman and Wolfman encounter stories day and night, and that is how I came across your channel. I figured it only made sense to reach out to you. I am amazed that the authorities are able to keep such a noisy event with so many witnesses under wraps. I have been searching for anybody who came forward or anything about the campground closing in the news. Nothing. I don't even know if anybody's been silenced. Look, I'm not interested in putting myself out there to the public. Truth be told, I'm almost as scared as the agents as I am the Dogmen. But all in all, they seem genuinely concerned for my well-being. I have some advice for anybody who decides to camp overnight in the wilderness of Pennsylvania. Bring some decent firepower with you, and your dog, too, if you've got one. Back when I was in my early 30s, for a very short time, I worked at a very small ranch in southwestern Montana. Having only worked at this ranch for around 19 or 20 months, we had our handful of issues. The biggest being something that you probably won't exactly believe me. So I'm just going to tell you. What the owner called them was buffalo wolves, if that's even a real thing. I had never even heard that name up until his mentioning of them. He thought they were some extinct form of wolves that have been around for a long time. But I guess this was actually a much more advanced species of wolf than I had ever come to know. I had seen them myself on several different occasions, tearing into livestock, being smart enough to manipulate parts of the fence to make it seamless, like they had never even crossed there, or even as far as covering their tracks, like a stealthy thief looking to break and enter in. All these things pointed to something other than a wolf, something far more advanced in intelligence, something far more human-like. Like I said, after having seen them myself, I know too much now. I don't claim to be an expert, but whatever you want to call them, buffalo wolves or what, these creatures are real, and they share far more many human-like characteristics than I'd like to think. For starters, I saw them clear as day, stand, walk, and live on 2 legs, just like a human being would, having no problems maneuvering or walking around, acting just fine. They also appear to move down onto all 4s, like that of a quadrupedal animal, again, having no problems ever shifting between one or the other. Also, in my mind, this presented an issue of balance. Most animals, I'd like to think, if not all, that walk on all 4, simply can't walk on 2. The balance of their body can't support 2 legs. But the way these animals' bodies were built, It was just so unnatural. Even the upper chest, the shoulders and the arms, looked far too human-like. Everything about this animal was wrong. I'm very fortunate that I have not had any personal run-ins, at least any that were up close or violent, thank the Lord. But the owner, on the other hand, had some personal accounts that he would never go into detail. He was always too scared to talk about it. Gee, I wonder why. Before I decided to sit down and write this, I thought I would educate myself, read up on other what they call Dogman encounters, or even through some of your episodes. And while after listening to many of them, I guess I should say that I'm surprised but not surprised by all the similarities that I too experienced. Like I had mentioned, the intelligence. But I didn't deal so much with the aggressiveness as many of the other people that you talk about. But instead of seeing livestock slaughtered, I witnessed them stealing them and taking them off into the north end of the ranch where they were coming through the forest. What happened to the livestock? I can only guess they were eaten. But personally, I was never tasked with going out and finding the cadavers or any remains. That was well beyond my pay grade. And I think the owner actually liked me, so he never wanted to task me with such things. I have no idea if he did himself. But any time that he knew these things were taken, or taking his livestock, he would just count that as a loss. He also seemed really apprehensive about doing any sort of self-defense against these animals, creatures, whatever you're wanting to call them. I don't know. Some sort of bio-anomaly, because I've never seen an animal that acted more like a human. I guess maybe if you think of an ape. But this was frighteningly smart. These things' overall ability to problem solve, think ahead, strategize, work in groups, and have a complete, actual understanding of the environment around them and how to work it to their good or their desire is just as frightening as it is admirable. I don't know if these creatures dwell in certain areas of the country, or maybe they're just a West Coast anomaly. Maybe they live on the East Coast. But again, after listening to many encounters, reading many encounter stories, they seem to be everywhere. Not just in one part of the US, but even Canada, Europe, Australia, even parts of India, I take it. I'm not sure what they are. I would think that they are some sort of common species of unknown animal. But maybe animal isn't even a term we should refer to them by, just because of how much like us they are. But back to my writing. And this is something that I witnessed firsthand. There were two of them that I saw, a larger one and a smaller one. The larger one wasn't as big as the largest one that we had saw, which I believe to be the alpha male. This one, I guess you could call a medium-sized one, was roughly 6 to 7 feet in height, pretty decent build, and the smaller one was probably closer to 5 feet, maybe a tad bit under, much more slender in build. I don't know how much younger it was, which I'm assuming was younger. They were both running in a group. When the big one, or bigger one, stopped and noticed it left tracks on the ground, it quickly did a hand gesture to the smaller one, alerted it down to the ground, and they both began intelligently covering up their tracks. At least that's what I assumed they were doing, considering there was grass in the way, and the soil was soft. If you were to walk over there, you would leave tracks in it with your boots. Well, the very next day, there was no sign of any tracks being over there. My boots did leave a mark, though, in the soft soil. That's how I know, and that's how I came to the conclusion that they were marking up their tracks at the time. When I saw them do this the previous evening, I wasn't exactly sure what they were doing, until the next day, when I realized they were indeed covering up tracks. How they did it, I'm not sure, because even as I stepped back and kicked dirt over my own tracks, trying to replicate any way that they could to cover up the tracks, it didn't quite fully work, and I don't have a great way to accurately describe how to cover up soil. At least the way these things did. But I will say that being as large as they are, there is no way that they could not leave tracks. I'm only 200 pounds soaking wet, and even I left a considerable impression in the soft soil with my boots. These things, being much larger in density and mass, they had to know what they were doing. No animal I've ever heard of is able to go back and cover their own tracks. What kind of predators exactly are we dealing with? Well, my 19 or 20 months would be up, and I moved out of state, down to Northern California. I eventually lost contact with the owner, because I think he either moved or changed his number. I'm not sure. But I don't really want to go back to think about what he had to deal with. And we didn't really talk about the whole buffalo wolf thing a whole bunch. It was talked about sometimes and mentioned here or there. Enough that I guess you can consider it a topic at hand, but it was not a part of our daily activity or daily conversation. It was only brought up every once in a while, and very brief, if anything. Although there were conversations of concern here and there. Enough that I knew they existed, after having seen them myself. I thought I would send this in to you, and add in my 2 cents of my encounter with these Dogman animals, or creatures or beings. I'm not sure what you refer to them as, but either way, I know they're out there. I know they exist, and who truly knows what they are capable of? This was back sometime in March or April of 2013. It was just beginning to get springtime, but not quite. It was still pretty foggy and rainy, but not freezing yet, or at least it was past the freezing part. I was on Facebook and got a message from a close friend of mine. I hadn't spoken to him in about over a month, and we were pretty decent friends. We would talk on and off. Anyway, he had a habit of randomly inviting me over for a little get-together or party, and I always gave in. This night, it was roughly 7:30. He shot me a message, asked me if I was available to come hang out with him and a few mutual friends of ours. I said yes, told me to be there around 9, in an hour and a half. I got ready, and he lives about 25 minutes away from me, a little bit out of town where there's a lot less houses. Where his house is kind of up on a hill, surrounded by a bunch of trees. The front of his house is not like a typical driveway. It's kind of just dirt, with about 4, 5, or 6 cars parked out in front, and a really bright floodlight. You kind of pull off this dirty gravel road, right up to his house, and that's it. In the back of his house is a really large hill that kind of slopes down, where he has a large bonfire, and woods surrounding all of that. That's only relevant to include because, well, that's where we'd usually party and have fun, not having to worry about neighbors, since there were really none close by him, at least not for a half a mile in either direction. Now, going out to his house, everything was fine. It was a little foggy, but dark, somewhat clear skies, not rainy. I think it was a little wet, considering the time of year. I pull up to his house, and the floodlight comes on. As soon as I do, I see this large shape of a dog, the largest dog I've ever seen in my life, jump out from behind his Ford, right next to my car, off into the bushes. I was kind of freaked out. This thing easily was the size of a lion. You know, lions from Africa, like a savanna lion. Something that could easily pounce and kill you. I remember pretty clearly jumping out of my car and running to the back of his yard, just because I was so spooked. I told him, and I said, "Dude, you have a flipping lion in your front yard." And he kind of looked at me strangely and laughed, thinking I was already drunk or something. And I explained to him what happened. Him and his sister, and a couple of our other mutual friends who were already there, were curious, but they kind of laughed it off, thinking that I was either playing a prank or just joking around. I kept going on about how serious I was, and what I saw did indeed happen. Well, they paid no notion to that, and kind of went on doing their thing. As the night went on, we quickly forgot all about the whole giant wolf-dog thing that I saw. At least, that's what the shape looked like. A giant dog. I didn't see any details because it was so dark. And the floodlight that came on the front of his house, which by the way is super bright, only gave details to a large silhouette. As the night went on, probably closer to midnight, I had drinking a little, but I was only buzzed. My friend who invited me over was beginning to black out. He's a much heavier drinker than I, and although I enjoy it, I prefer social drinking more. I've never been a fan of getting drunk. I like a buzz here and there, like anyone else, but that's about where I stop. My other mutual friends, who had later on arrived, they were all getting pretty buzzed too, somewhere between there and drunk. That's when we started hearing noises off in the woods in the distance. Between the bonfire and the entrance of the woods, maybe 200 yards. It's pretty large open space. I mean, you could easily go ATVing. I think there were woods and trees around here at some point, but long before my friend bought the property, it was all cleared and torn out. So it's just a giant clearing. Well, we heard all sorts of crashing woods and noises, sounding like a large animal crashing through the trees, making all sorts of noises. I didn't hear any howling or any other animal noises, just the crashing sound, like something big trampling about. I'm trying to paint this picture for you. Imagine the Hulk, and put him in the middle of the woods in a dark forest at nighttime. Imagine the noise he would make moving around, pushing trees over, stomping around. You would probably guess that there's some sort of heavy machinery going around. Well, yeah, that's just how loud it was. Except there was no machinery sounds accompanying it. It was just crashing, thrashing. And while some of our friends were mildly concerned, I say mildly, because their state of inebriation took over more control than their actual sobering concern of what was in the woods. I was the only one that really began to get nervous, and this went on for quite a while, maybe close to an hour off and on, and then suddenly stopped, along with all the sounds of the night. Crickets, even the wind. It was dead silent. Now, it was about 1 or 1:30 in the morning, and most everybody but I was pretty drunk. So much so, they were able to ignore any eeriness that was felt in the air. Sitting out there in the quiet for maybe 10-15 minutes, I made the announcement that I'm going to go inside, lay down, and that they should all come inside with me, that we should put out the bonfire and put in a night. Some of them agreed. My other friend being so drunk that he was pretty much out. Whatever. I know it was probably a mistake, but I left him out there. 2/3 of us, I would say, decided to put out the fire and go in, while the other few sat outside, still talking. They came in at some point, but I had fallen asleep. Luckily, my friend had a pretty large house and a very large living room. Many places on the floor to crash. He had mattresses and pads all over, so it wasn't hard to find a spot to crash down on and lay on. I mean, he had his living room set up, so that way 10 or 15 people at a time could crash out. Pretty nice setup, actually, and it worked out in our favor. Not to mention the giant window panes all over the walls, meaning you could perfectly see out to the bonfire area and where all the woods was. Even though I was pretty creeped out and a little buzzed still, I decided I should try and fall asleep, and miraculously, I did. The next day, I had woken up. Everybody was inside. I was one of the first ones up, and decided I should head home. But I talked to my friend first, and asked him how things were going, and then I told him I was very uncomfortable the previous night. He said, when he got up to go back in the house, since he was one of the last ones, he told me he had this intense feeling like something or somebody was watching him. He had looked around, but not seen anybody. But he told me that this sounds weird, because it coincides with what I told him, that he felt like something or somebody was watching him through the woods. I asked him could it have been neighbors who were coming over to try and maybe play tricks on us, but he told me no. The only neighbor, who lives about a half-mile away in that direction, is an elderly couple. There's no reason they would be going through the woods over to his property around 1:30 or later in the morning. For what reason? This couple was at least 80. I think the man was in a wheelchair even. There's no way or reason that would be a thing. Anyway, I know this is probably a dumb story, but my friend totally got the creeps. We never did figure out what that silhouette of the large dog was, or what the crashing sounds were in the woods, but I can't help but find it awfully fishy that weird stuff happened to not only me, but him as well, and we both acknowledged it. Everybody else, though, seemed to downplay it severely. Like maybe they knew, but they really didn't want to know. Anyway, like I said, this was back in 2013. I've had no sort of experiences since then. It has really been the only thing that I've had that was weird remotely, and I've been out there many times since that day. Again, with nothing weird happening. So maybe it was a fluke. I'm not sure. Maybe we truly did encounter a Dogman that night. We'll never know, I guess. I just hope that it never decides to come back. I'm really glad I found your channel, and while I've been debating about writing this into you, about the whole experience and wondering if it truly fits in with any of your stories, I thought, hey, why not? If you don't decide to use it, it is what it is. But if you do, I really hope your listeners can appreciate what I have to say. Now, let's back this up a little. The man in question is and was a good friend of mine. Up until around the end of 2016, died of a massive heart attack. Sometime before Thanksgiving, if I remember correctly. I'm not going to say his actual name, so I'll refer to him as Earl. Earl eventually found God, cleaned up his life, and became a pretty decent guy. But, pre-2000s, he was a bad guy to mess with. In and out of prison, sold and did a lot of drugs, did a lot of bad things, even murdered people. But his primary occupation was a pimp for at least 8 or 9 years. And during that time, he had some crazy stories that he shared with me. One being something about werewolves. Now, get this. So, at the time that him being a pimp, he ruled over, I guess if that's the correct terminology, a handful of prostitutes. He operated them in this really shady part of town, off in the outskirts, where it was a little bit more wooded, tucked away, but just as much a part of the city as any other part would be. Of course, with all the gang rivalry and gang banging, there would always be violence and, of course, drugs being sold. I should also clarify that if you're not familiar with slang, gang banging is not referring to an orgy, but actual gang activity, killing, violence, any sort of gang activity that you can think of, at least to my knowledge. While that was going around in plentiful amounts, there was also prostitutes going missing left and right. Now, on occasion this does happen. If you go to any major metropolis and you talk to any pimp, which I hope you wouldn't do, because they are dangerous men, but sometimes prostitutes are kidnapped. Sometimes they're killed. They are in a way seen as property of other pimps, so it makes sense that rival pimps would do this. But there was a horrible, horrible reason for this. Some of the prostitutes, who were friends with the other prostitutes, kept claiming that they would see this large black dog with tall pointed ears, walking on 2 legs, which they would refer to as a werewolf, keep coming after the other prostitutes, attacking them, and eventually, multiple of these prostitutes would disappear. At least 5 of them in this same little area all vanished without a trace. Before truly finding out what was the cause of this, he ended up serving a prison term and getting out. And shortly after that, it was about at the end of his gang life, which would mean he turned over his life completely afterwards. So that was just a closed chapter. He never did find out. And I'm just telling you all this to give a backstory to the reasoning. He told me it always bothered him, and he found it weird, that his prostitutes kept referring to the same description of what they were seeing. Of course, he would beat them, mock them, force them to do stuff on him, as well as other people for more money, because he thought they were trying to get out of it. But he just now can't get around the fact that they would use the same descriptions. The tall, pointed black ears. The fact that it looked, whatever it was, like a werewolf. He doesn't really believe in werewolves or anything like that. He's just more haunted that they would go missing, all saying that they saw this same creature or thing, and wonders if there's a reason behind that. I'm sorry I don't know as much information as I'd like to. I wish I would have talked to him more about it. But when he had shared it with me, I always found it very interesting, thinking at the time that the idea of a werewolf was a possibility. Now that I know about the idea of cryptids, and that they do exist, and the whole phenomenon with Dogman, I almost wonder if indeed that's what they were seeing. I should also state that this period of him prostituting these girls out was somewhere in the 90s. I think 1991 to 99 is to be exact, but I can't quite remember for sure, but it was sometime around there. And I also want to say too that the area these prostitutes served in was somewhere close by to Chicago. It wasn't a sect of Chicago if I remember right. It was a little bit past that, but still a busy area, just a little bit more forested than a big city. When I was 17, I used to hang out with my buddy, literally all the time during the summertime. We really had nothing else better to do. And I can distinctly remember one evening, we were bored. I think I had about $8 or $9, and I told my friend, hey, let's go walk to the store, get some Mountain Dews. Come back and we'll play video games. We did those things already, but for whatever reason, I was really craving a Mountain Dew then. I don't know why. So, he agreed, and we both walked down to the store. Now, the store was quite a bit of ways away, and you had to walk through this really sketchy long stretch of road that had thick woods on both sides. Being in California, at least middle to upper California, these were forests, like the kind of forest you see in the Pacific Northwest, not the shrubbery and loose woods that you see down in Southern California. I thought I should make that distinction. We had walked this stretch of road many times. I think it was a little over a mile, maybe a mile and a half. But we would go there often to get snacks, soda, and whatever stuff that a 17-year-old eats. Well, this time was really no different. And it being the summer evening, the sun was still out, and it was still beautiful weather. Active people walking their dogs, and cars going back and forth. It wasn't a dead road by any means, but there were fewer houses. I'm wanting to say all this stuff because I want to mention that this was a very lively area. Maybe not as lively as any downtown area, but there were people present, cars going by, as I just said. We were maybe halfway there to the store, when we heard strange noises off to the forest across the street. It made us both stop, look at each other, and question, what was that we had just heard? It sounded like a dog getting ripped apart, or something. Maybe like a cougar attacking a dog. I think after discussing it for a moment, that was the conclusion we came to. But it didn't quite sound like that. And living in California, I've had my fair share of hearing cougars, although I've only heard a few dogs. But this is exactly what it would sound like. So, we kept on walking, going back on our conversation of whatever it was we were talking about. Maybe 10 minutes later, we're now nearing the end of the walk, and we hear it again, except this time the noises are more distorted and closer, as if whatever it was following us parallel in the woods. This time, though, the sounds were different. It didn't sound like another animal attacking a dog or something. And when I mentioned it the first time, I mentioned the accompanying noises of a cougar making noise like a hissing sound, along with the whimpering and whining of a dog, even though they didn't sound quite right, not like you'd actually hear. I know it's very hard to explain, but when we got near the end of the walk and we heard these noises again, they were different. It's almost like the sound of a dog and the hissing of a cat or something like that was overlaid on top of each other. It sounded very large and very distorted, like playing through a lo-fi radio or something. And whatever it was seemed to sound really big. Like, imagine a bison making that noise. Something of enormous size. It's really hard to describe accurately. My friend and I just kept looking at each other, like, what on earth is making those noises? There were some passerbyers on the other end of the street, a biker, and a lady walking her German Shepherd, all three of which, including the dog, made glances at the noises and seemed to carry on. The lady, if I remember right, even had her headphones in, and I remember that she looked over too, signifying that me and my friend were not indeed crazy, and we were hearing something strange and out of the ordinary. So here's where the story gets even crazier. We go to the store, and we both load up on Mountain Dew, since being 17, you seem to think you're really cool if you drink Mountain Dew. I'm really not sure what my obsession was at that age. So we're leaving, and we're about halfway back down this long stretch of road. Keep in mind, it's probably somewhere between 7 and 8, in the midst of summer. 7 or 8, I think. And it's still sunny out. Cars are still going by. There's still people walking. It's still lively. It's California after all. The noises begin to even get more violent sounding, if that makes any sense. It sounded like a flock of animals being ripped apart, minus the skin-ripping noises and blood and tissues being torn. I don't know how else to accurately tell you. That's what it sounded like. Like you would hear a roar, and overlaid with that roar was what sounded like distorted dog screams. I don't know. My friend, when we ended up getting back, said that he might think it might be a skinwalker. But I don't know. It didn't sound far off into the woods, and I had never even heard of a skinwalker before. He ended up telling me what a skinwalker was. He's not native, but he does have native friends, and has heard of what they are before. Except we were in California, nowhere near any reservation that I am or was aware of at the time. Well, come to find out later that night, people in that area had reported seeing a large, strange, upright canine figure in the area. I know this because he called a friend of his, or maybe it was a family member, one or the other, I can't quite remember, and they were talking about the weird noises that we had just heard a few hours prior. He got on the conversation over the phone, and since his friend, or family member, whichever it was on speakerphone, he didn't know he was on speakerphone, was talking about it, and saying that yeah, the whole neighborhood's kind of freaked out right now. They're not sure what it was. And I almost motioned to him, asking if he meant werewolf. My friend mentioned the word werewolves, and he said, nah, that's not what it was. It's something else entirely. Some strange animal, we don't know what it is. And then the rest of the conversation went as normal. And since then, I've always had this thing that I do believe that werewolves or animals like that exist somewhere. Maybe a skinwalker, maybe a werewolf, I don't know. Out here in California, though, I wouldn't put it past me that something weird is out there lurking in the darkness of the woods. My grandmother for years had a small little ranch which she ran with my grandfather, and they had an abundant amount of beautiful horses. They all trained and took care of, all by hand, all by themselves, even in their elderly old age. At some point, my grandfather got very sick and eventually passed. My grandmother, now having all the responsibilities of animal care and life fall onto her solely, she enlisted the help of me and my two sisters. Me and my sister, being twins, just graduated high school, and with no college plans ahead, we thought it would be a perfect time to help take care of Grandma, since we were very close with her at the time. My older sister, who's 5 years older than me and my other sister, could only help periodically, as she already had started her budding career. Things went great for the first couple months. That is, until spring rolled around, when we started seeing large gray wolves come onto the ranch and attack her animals I've known that there are wolves in Wyoming, but I had no idea they were these large. These were huge wolves, easily the same size as the horses, and they would always come in packs of 2 or 3. Very, very large animals, although they looked different than your standard wolf. They were much more slender in the back, and slightly disproportionate body, much more engorged with blood and muscles on the front, just over the top, and their heads were massive, tall, lengthy, spiky ears, and a face that looked very, very mean. They got 2 of my grandmother's horses, tore them to shreds, actually, so old Granny resorted to using some firepower, which seemed to work for some time, but only managed to scare them away, and ultimately make them angry. For about a month, maybe a little bit more, they went away, stopped appearing altogether, and then one night, early June, they came back and tried to break into the house. I remember, me and my sister were sitting down playing a board game. My grandmother was still up, probably doing dishes. That's when we heard the door violently rattle. We were all startled, and my grandmother grabbed the gun. All I had on me was a machete, which I kept on me all the time. It was just nice to have. A very handy weapon and tool. The door was violently shaking, the handle rattling. I peeked out the window and saw this thing pressing its face against the glass, snarling, banging on the door, trying so hard to break it down. My grandmother did something I can't believe she did. She literally put the gun up to the glass and pulled the trigger, shooting this thing right in the face and blowing the entire side window out of her house along with it. This thing ran away in pain, yelping, since she had just shot it point blank in the face with a rifle. She didn't even care that her window is now shattered. She cared more about killing whatever these things were and harming her horses. After it happened, she just opened the front door, ran out to the front porch, and fired at it a couple more times as it ran off into the night. She came back, looked at the window, and said to us out loud, "Who's staying up on watch with me tonight to make sure those things don't come back and try to get into the house?" Me and my sister were shocked. My grandma's pretty hardcore, but this was easily one of her most hardcore moments I've ever seen. She's fearless. She then made a couple cups of tea and stayed up with us until sunrise, until she could call somebody to come and repair the window. When the guy came and asked what happened, she just said there was a minor accident, even though it was obvious. Somebody clearly fired a gun outside the window. Glass shattered everywhere. She said she had to shoot at a bunch of coyotes coming for her horses. We never saw these large wolves much after that. They would show up here and then sometimes, at the very tip of the property line, but they never again tried to mess with Grandma's horses, or even come up on the property much. We never did see the big one that tried to break into the house, which almost did, mind you. It was angry, but having shot it point blank in the face, probably in the eye, knowing Grandma, and how vindictive she is, it probably either died or never had the cojones to return. And for a current 2021 update, my grandma is still alive, has dealt with breast cancer, a sickness, and COVID, and has survived all of it, and is still hard as a rock. What a tough lady. In this case, Grandma 1, Dogman 0. I live right next to a national forest, and there's even a little half-mile trail loop that I usually walk every morning, if not every other morning. But lately, my dog, which is a pit bull, mind you, has been acting very weird, very scared. That's unlike my dog, who acts like he's king of the woods, very proud and strong every time we go on our morning hike. Although lately, the woods do feel a bit out of place. It's been very quiet, and kind of an eerie feeling in the air lately. So, I don't know. Dogs are pretty good about sensing things that are around them. And although I agree, things are a little off. Nothing that I don't think is wrong. But maybe I should trust my dog's intuition, because he probably knows something that I don't. Perhaps a predator is in the area. What would that even be? When I was 15, my father used to have a rather large tool shed, which he, for whatever reason, dismantled the following summer and rebuilt a new one much closer to the house. I feel that the reason was because, well, A, he had to walk too far, but B, I think it had something in part to do with this encounter. My dad's kind of a pack rat and is an avid hunter, so he stuffs all of his junk and stuff in this shed, as well as many things he finds, like deer sheddings and skulls and bones. Anything he finds of interest, he just shoves in this shed. It's kind of a disorganized mess, or was. Well, it still is. I've seen his newer shed, but things have never changed, and it's always been that way. I remember when I was 15 in the summertime, for whatever reason, this werewolf-like creature began being attracted to his shed, and I still will never forget the very first time that I saw it trying to get into his shed. I was up playing video games, and I was alerted by a banging noise over and over. I kind of thought to myself it was probably raccoons, because my dad also keeps our trash cans over by the shed. For whatever reason, I don't know. So it was banging around. After this went on for about 10 minutes, I was kind of getting annoyed now and was going to go shut my window. I didn't have any AC, so I frequently opened my window at night to let some cool summer air in. As I went to go shut my window, I looked, and I saw this tall, gray, brown, hairy-looking creature trying to break into the shed. My dad keeps a mighty fine padlock on the front, so it's not just easy to get in. He has some of his old valuables in there as well. This thing was violently shaking the shed, ramming its head against it, its body, and trying to break the door down. I freaked out, ran downstairs, ran into my parents' room, and told him, "There's some large animal on 2 legs trying to get into your shed. You should probably see this." My dad, alerted, jumped up, grabs his revolver, and walks outside. The thing is now gone. He now angrily turns his attention towards me and acts as if I set him up for a prank. It tells me to go back to bed, and unless his shed has actually been broken into, don't bother waking him up. Oh man, I almost nearly got grounded for that one. Whatever. So I went back up to playing video games. Nothing happened the rest of the night. And as the summer progressed, I would keep seeing this thing come back, keep trying to break into my father's little shed, but it never could. It looked pretty large, but I only ever saw it at nighttime. Some nights there was a little bit of overcast, so my visibility wasn't as good. And other nights, the moon would be bright and full, and a starlit sky, and you could see it pretty well. It was fairly tall, maybe taller than my dad, who was 6'5", but it was also very slender. It looked just like a werewolf you'd see out of a movie, and I feel very lucky to the point that I never got its attention. For whatever reason, it just seemed so fixated on that shed, and would spend anywhere from 20 minutes to sometimes an hour just trying to break into it, and then eventually give up and disappear. This would happen at completely random intervals, sometimes a couple of nights a week, sometimes once every 3 weeks. It was random. So I would often ask my dad if he kept any dead animals in there, or, like maybe bones with still meat on them that could smell, and he always told me no. Even the skulls he found and the deer sheddings were pretty clean, so I'm not sure what that was about. Why it was trying to break into the shed, I'll never know. And why it never attempted to come to the house, I don't know. So the summer progresses, and now we get to about the end of August. Well, my dad was out there one night, dealing with something in the shed. I think he was either getting something out, or putting something away. I was doing my usual, playing Xbox up in my room with the window open. I heard him fumbling around. Then it went silent for a bit, not really paying too much attention to what was going on outside. I was more focused on playing Halo 2. Then, I hear him yell, and fire off his revolver twice. and I hear this horrible howl screech thing that sounded so inhuman. It sounded like a beast. I immediately jump up, throwing my controller down and looking at my window. My dad is full-fledged, white as a sheet, running towards the house with his revolver in hand. I immediately run down the stairs to greet him as he's coming in the house. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. Eyes as big as saucers, face completely drained of blood, and I asked him, "Did you see the werewolf thing?" He didn't answer me. He just locked the door and told me, "Listen, you are not allowed to go out at night. Do you understand me? Never." And I said, "Did you see what I saw?" He never acknowledged my question. I feel like he was too afraid to answer me. Anyway, literally within the next couple weeks, he dismantled that shed, started by removing everything in it and moving it by the side front of the house. Then, within a week, had the shed completely demolished and torn down. That was the end of that. Now, the shed is probably no more than 20-30 feet away from the house, a little bit bigger too, and has multiple padlocks on it. And all the way up until I finished high school, there hadn't been an issue with the shed, at least to my knowledge, and seeing this creature. Maybe him shooting at it with a revolver was enough to scare it away. After high school, I moved out and into college. Then after college, I moved away and roommated with some friends. I still visited, somewhat often, maybe bi-monthly or bi-weekly, depending on how busy I was. I would ask my dad sometimes, "Does it still come around?" He would just get quiet, and then just shake his head no. So it's not like I could get much out of him. Sorry this is becoming so long, but that's my werewolf story. I'd like to start this off with a little bit of background information on me. I'm 30 years old. My name is William, and I have a sadistical love for the outdoors, hiking and going into hard climates and places that aren't exactly easy to traverse. I've never been one to go into a half-mile loop, something easily doable. I like to climb mountains, go into the thick, boggy swamps, any terrain that's pretty rough. Because of this, you'll usually find things other people will never see, which sets up for my story, which, by the way, I have information to back up my story, from the past, from things that I've learned from native culture. So, here we go. I believe there's a turf war going on. Oh, and one last thing. I also do believe in cryptids. I've had Bigfoot encounters as well as Dogman encounters in the past, but I'll save that for another time. Anyway, I was saying, I do believe there is a territorial turf war between cryptids, specifically in the southern point of Mississippi. See, just a couple years ago, I was hiking deep in the marshlands, actually, right along the Pascagoula River, which is very southern Mississippi. It's pretty much out in the middle of nowhere, and this is where I saw the most horrible thing that I ever have. Even more frightening than my Dogman and Bigfoot encounters. This was almost night. It was pretty dark, but you could still see somewhat, enough that I could see what was happening in front of me. I saw, well, it started off with screams and loud sounds, which prompted me to follow, off in the brush. I heard what sounded like screaming, not human screams, like a giant wolf or something like that, screaming in pain. It's hard to say. It sounded like something distorted, like animal sounds together, and I could also hear some sort of hissing, almost like a dinosaur roaring. Crazy sounds, I know. But then I peeked through, and I saw a scene straight out of a Hollywood horror movie. This large black dog, with sharp pointed ears, standing upright on two legs, massive bulging muscles, was being attacked by what I can only describe as half-human, half-Komodo dragon, I guess. It was very lizard-like. Whatever they were about halfway in the water, and they were fighting very violently. Then, in a split second, just by the sight alone, I knew that I was seeing a dogman, and it was fighting some sort of reptilian creature. This thing, the reptilian creature, reaches up in one quick motion and tears part of the pec muscle off its body, flesh included, leaving a gaping hole and blood pouring out. The Dogman creature screams out in pain and lashes and bites down, tearing part of the shoulder open of the reptilian creature, covered in thick spikes and armor, or what it appeared to be. More like armor like an alligator has, not literal metal and steel armor. That thing screamed and hissed too. It continued to be a bloody brawl. I watched in horror for maybe 20 more seconds. I have to realize it was probably only that short, but time seemed to slow as I was watching the horror in front of me. They brawled for a few more seconds, and then, like a shark ascending up to bite into a seal, this thing jumped up and bit and tore out the throat of the Dogman creature, causing the Dogman to fall all the way back and fully submerge into the water, where this creature, that looked far more like a Komodo dragon and an alligator and a human in one, but more like a Komodo dragon than anything, grabbed its body and pulled it underneath. There was blood. I was so terrified watching this that I had completely urinated my own pants. I figured now was my own chance to escape. So, I turned around and as quietly and as quickly as possible, ran back to where I had hiked from. If you want to verify my sighting yourself, I parked along Old River Road. It's still southern Mississippi, but a little bit north, and the Pascagoula River runs all through there. The brush is pretty thick, so good luck trying to traverse through it. After having 3 other separate Dogman encounters, which I will send to you now that I think about it, I knew what a Dogman was, and what it looked like. I also knew how smart and how powerful they were, what they were capable of. And by the way, both of these creatures, or cryptids as you call them, are incredibly large and very powerful. This Dogman wasn't no wimp, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, slender in the legs, but very muscular in the arms and chest. In fact, it looked a lot like one of the other Dogmen that I saw in Texas, but I'll get to that in another story. As far as the reptilian creature, it just flat out looked freaky, looked wrong. It kind of reminded me of something you'd see if you were to go to hell. Just evil, sinister looking. The way it had its spines on its back, and the way it resembled a human, an alligator, and very prominently a Komodo dragon all in one. It was just frightening to look at, and was also just a tad bit taller than the Dogman. Probably not by much though, not by several feet, but it seemed to be a little bit larger, and was much more thicker and built, like a tank. And while this lizard thing appeared to take damage too, physically, it just seemed to have the upper hand and have more power than the Dogman did. But the Dogman did put up a good fight. Once it had fully submerged into the water very quickly with the corpse of the Dogman, I didn't stick around to see what was going to happen. I booked it out of there and was happily gone. In fact, the entire thing seemed so surreal. It doesn't even feel like it actually happened. Seeing something like that is seeing like a hyena and a lion fight in the wild. Yeah, it happens. There's documentation of it. But it's more rare. But it wasn't until summer of 2019 where I stumbled upon your channel. And not too long after, you started releasing stuff on reptilian creatures that nobody else had. Talking about alligator men living in the swamps of the South. Although nothing you released or talked about sounds exactly similar to what I saw, a lizard-like creature. You're kinda in the same ballpark with the alligator man thing. An apex lizard-like predator that is half human, half lizard is definitely here in the swamps. This thing looked more like a horrible cryptid genetic experiment than anything else, which leads me to believe that there's probably cryptids all over the United States. Flying, reptilian, dog, possibly cat, because I've heard of people talk about werebears and werecats, although I have nothing to say about them. Never seen them or heard stories about them, personally of course. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's cryptids of all variety, and naturally, it would make sense that they would have territory wars, or come in as squabbles here and there, which I can't believe I happened to come and see. But, had I not heard the screaming, and all the commotion, I wouldn't have even been bothered to actually come and see what it was. I would have just stayed in the trees. However, there is some evidence to support what I saw does actually happen out when people don't realize it. For example, I heard a Bigfoot story a while back that somebody, forgive me because I don't remember the location, they were up in the mountains, possibly the Sierra Nevadas up in California, but don't quote me on that. They had witnessed, from a distance, 2 Bigfoots fighting to the death. One Bigfoot eventually overpowered the other, grabbed a large rock, and bashed the other's head in. There was also another one, where another person had seen 2 Dogman fighting, where the more dominant one, believed to be the alpha male, tore out the throat of the smaller one. So right then, we know these things do exist, and not only exist, but these wars between them also happen. Then, in native culture even, there's even talk. I'm talking about the Plains Indians here. There's even talks about their tribes going to war with Dogman and Bigfoot and Dogman also warring against each other. I didn't know these things at the time. Before I wrote this story out to send to you, I tried to educate myself as much as I could, listening to many of your reptilian episodes, just to see if I can find the creature that I saw, that maybe somebody out there would describe it as seen. But no. This also makes me theorize that maybe there are different varieties of reptilian creatures. You have reptilians that are shapeshifters, take the form of people, as you've talked about in some of your episodes, where people see people with reptilian eyes, who I believe are disguised as humans. Then you have the more cryptid creature side of it, where you actually see tall reptilian creatures, half man, half dinosaur, I've heard descriptions of, which might be the closest relation to what I saw, although I prefer Komodo dragon, because it looks more like that than, say, a dinosaur. Then other people, which is the most common, have talked about a half man, half alligator, which I've already mentioned. That seems to be the most common. And then, of course, you have these large reptilian creatures that look more like giant lizards. There's also talks about tunnels and burrows being dug in the swamps. And if I'm totally honest with you, the more and more I listen, the more I've experienced, the swamps are just sounding like a less and less safe place to be in, to visit, to hike around, to thrash around in, to explore. I myself would not want to be caught off guard and be attacked by either a dogman or one of these reptilian things living in the swamps. For all I know, it's their territory, and has been their territory for a very long time. On the other side, there also seems to be a ton of dogman encounters and sightings, not even in just the New Orleans area, but also around Mississippi, the state that I'm currently residing in, which is scary. But again, it would support the evidence that there is a clear territorial war, and if you're not around in the deep parts of the marsh and swamp, you're never even going to know what truly goes on. Just like when animals duke it out in the middle of the wilderness, you would never know. As frightening as this really is, it's apparent that we are dealing with 2 apex predators here, both far more intelligent, larger, faster, and more powerful than any of us. I really believe we're no longer on the top of the food chain. We've been clearly outmatched, and I feel it's time to really learn our place. If these things are going to be having a territory war, who knows how long it's going to go on for? And ultimately, who knows how long it's been going on for? If the natives of the plains have talked about it, there might be a war between all of them that we don't even realize. This is not something we want to get into the middle of. You know, looking back on that moment, that felt like it lasted forever, or that time came to a slowdown. I regret not having my phone, because I felt like I was in a moment where I could have captured it on video. But I left most of my stuff in the car, considering during hiking and walking around, I don't want to risk damaging or breaking anything I have. Plus, I never stray too far from my car, only a couple of miles, so I'm never bound to get lost and need complete rescuing. But this was just something otherworldly. Once I heard it, I could not turn away. And also keep in mind, there are people that live close to there. There's no way they did not hear it. These sounds were incredibly loud. The amount of decibels and volume were easily the sounds of 2 elephants fighting. I mean, it was loud. It clearly got my attention. And I didn't recognize the noises, or at least the style in which the noises were happening, like 2 animals fighting. The hissing and the growling and the howling. It didn't make sense, so I was pretty much obligated to go check it out. This experience has sure really made me reevaluate where I choose to explore, where I choose to go hiking, and when and where I go. I don't want to end up running into something else's territory, especially if it's a violent cryptid or very territorial Bigfoot. You just can never know anymore. Not after what I saw, and not after my several violent experiences with Dogman, Bigfoots, and now this. Peace be with you.